The smirk above France, April 8, 1943. The sky was crisp and the air thin, 27,000 feet above occupied France. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermaken's laughter echoed through his intercom as he watched the massive American Thunderbolts struggle for altitude. They were, in his words, nothing but flying milk bottles, ripe for the slaughter. Little did he know, these awkward giants would soon rewrite the rules of air combat. At the time, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was the undisputed master of the skies over Europe. For years, they had dominated the aerial battlefield with their fleet of nimble, high-performance fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were precision tools of death. Light, fast, and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. German aces, hardened through years of combat in Spain, Poland, France, and Britain, were used to dealing with Allied aircraft that required finesse to defeat. They expected their new opponents, the P-47 Thunderbolts, to be no different. But the Thunderbolt was no ordinary fighter. To a German pilot, it appeared slow, cumbersome, and overweight. Its body seemed too large for the wings that struggled to keep it aloft. Its massive radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, sounded almost comical. A deep rumble, far less graceful than the purring whine of the Luftwaffe's sleek machines. The P-47s were slower to climb, heavier to turn, and, by German standards, inefficient in the air. They were an affront to the philosophy of agile dogfights and quick strikes that the Luftwaffe had mastered. To the seasoned veterans of the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt was little more than a clumsy target. But beneath this external mockery lay a brutal machine, designed not for speed or grace, but for survival. The P-47 was built to absorb punishment, to endure what no other aircraft could, and most importantly, to unleash hell once its guns were in range. Its .850 caliber Browning machine guns could unleash a staggering barrage of bullets, and its tough construction could endure damage that would send other fighters tumbling from the sky. On that morning of April 8, 1943, the Thunderbolts had only one thing going for them. They had no idea what they were facing. The American pilots flying the P-47 were mostly green, fresh from training and eager for their first taste of combat. They had no experience facing the Luftwaffe's aces, and they had no way of knowing how vastly different the reality of aerial warfare in Europe would be. Still, they climbed into their aircraft, unaware that their enemies, the very ones who mocked their machines, were already sizing them up as easy prey. But Major Donald Bliley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, saw something in the Thunderbolt that no one else did. Not yet. Bliley had flown with the RAF's Eagle Squadron, and his experience fighting the Luftwaffe gave him a unique perspective. He knew that the key to surviving in the P-47 wasn't agility or dogfighting skill. It was raw power. The Thunderbolt wasn't meant to climb like a Spitfire or dive like a Focke-Wulf. It was built to endure and outlast. Bliley knew that the Thunderbolt could take hits that would cripple any other aircraft and still come home. In the coming months, the Thunderbolts would begin to show their true potential. The Germans would learn, too late, that the P-47's armor was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Its rugged build, its ability to shrug off damage, and its firepower would quickly turn the tide. What seemed like a slow, lumbering target would soon become a terrifying presence in the skies. By the time the Luftwaffe realized the mistake they had made in underestimating the Thunderbolt, the war had already begun to change. They had mocked the American aircraft, dismissing it as a mere curiosity. They were wrong. The Thunderbolt was the culmination of American industrial might, a product of mass production, engineering ingenuity, and the unyielding resolve of a country determined to win at all costs. It wasn't the fastest, nor the most agile, but it didn't need to be. It was built for a different kind of warfare, a war of attrition, where the machine that could survive the longest would win. As Oberleutnant Hermaken's smirk faded into disbelief, the American pilots were learning quickly. The P-47 had proven itself in combat already, and as the months passed, the aircraft's reputation would only grow. From awkward targets, they would become the most feared weapon in the sky, a symbol of American resilience and industrial power. But for now, in the thin air above occupied France, it was still a joke. The Germans, for the moment, had the upper hand, but things were about to change. The war in the sky was about to take a turn, and the Luftwaffe would soon find itself confronting a new kind of fighter, a fighter it had never anticipated, one that would prove to be the very embodiment of American determination. And when that thunderclap filled the air, it would be too late for them to escape. The Thunderbolt's first battle. Ignored and mocked in April 1943, American pilots flying the P-47 Thunderbolt had little experience in combat. But their German counterparts, veterans of the Luftwaffe's fiercest campaigns, underestimated the raw power beneath the Thunderbolt's heavy frame. The first encounters were brutal, with the P-47's weaknesses exposed, but something else was beginning to emerge, something the Germans could not foresee. The air was cold and filled with the hum of engines as the inexperienced pilots of the 4th Fighter Group climbed into their P-47s. The war was no longer confined to the distant sky over Britain. Now, it was over the continent, and the Americans had arrived, eager to test their mettle. They had trained for this moment, drilled in the art of aerial combat, but nothing could prepare them for the harsh realities of a battlefield where veterans of the Luftwaffe ruled. The skies over Europe were home to the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. They were seasoned, ruthless, and every inch of their aircraft was tuned for speed, maneuverability, and deadly precision. The P-47 Thunderbolts, by contrast, were clunky, slow to climb, and unwieldy compared to the nimble German fighters. They were the antithesis of the German design philosophy, built for agility, speed, and quick, decisive combat. The Thunderbolts were built to endure, to fly through damage that would have grounded any other aircraft. And while they were armed with an extraordinary 850 caliber machine guns, their slow, lumbering movements made them seem like easy prey. The Germans took one look at these heavy aircraft and laughed. They saw no threat, just an oversized target. In those first encounters, the P-47's flaws were glaringly apparent. The Thunderbolt struggled to keep up with the swift vertical assaults of the German Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, which easily took advantage of the Thunderbolt's inability to climb fast enough or turn tightly enough to engage in classic dogfights. Early combat reports were grim. The American pilots were losing more Thunderbolts than they could afford, and the numbers were hardly in their favor. The Germans, with their superior numbers and skill, were picking them off with ease, leading many to conclude that the P-47 was simply a failure. But there was something the Germans missed. The P-47, though slow and ponderous in the climb, was incredibly resilient. American pilots learned quickly that their aircraft was a machine of survival. They had not yet mastered the nuances of combat in the skies over Europe, but they had learned one crucial lesson. The P-47 could take a beating. In their first encounters, many Thunderbolts returned to base riddled with bullets and cannon shells, yet still flew, tattered and torn, but not broken. Where a Spitfire or a Bf 109 would have been destroyed, the Thunderbolt kept going. The heavy frame, the rugged construction, and the radial engine, all these elements combined to create a machine that could endure far more than any of its adversaries could comprehend. In contrast, the German pilots had become accustomed to aircraft that would fall apart after a few direct hits. A bullet hole in a Bf 109's fragile wing, a cannon strike to a Focke-Wulf 190's fuselage, and it would be game over. The Thunderbolt didn't follow those rules. Its tough exterior, reinforced with thick steel plating and a powerful radial engine, allowed it to shrug off what would have destroyed any other fighter. And so, slowly, the Germans began to notice something strange. The Thunderbolts that returned to base after a fight weren't falling from the sky in the same way as the other aircraft. The damage reports were like something from a nightmare. One Thunderbolt returned from a mission with 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun hits, yet the aircraft had still made it back to base. It was a shock. How could such a large, slow fighter survive what would have killed a more nimble aircraft? How could it keep flying with such damage, where others would have plummeted to the ground? The first signs of the Thunderbolt's true potential emerged in these early months. Although the Germans were still confident in their superiority, the Thunderbolt's durability began to sow seeds of doubt. It wasn't about how fast it could climb, how agile it could be in a turn, or how well it could dive. It was about something more fundamental, the ability to endure, and to fight back with overwhelming firepower. The German pilots didn't realize that the P-47's strengths lay not in how it performed on paper, but in its ability to outlast the enemy, absorb damage, and then return the favor with deadly precision. When the Americans returned fire with their 8 50 caliber machine guns, it wasn't just a burst of bullets, it was a deluge. In combat, the P-47's guns unleashed a wall of lead, and that wall would soon be enough to tear through even the best German fighters in mere seconds. By the time the first months of combat ended, the P-47 had earned its reputation, not as the fastest or the most agile, but as a fighter that could take whatever the enemy threw at it and keep fighting. The Germans were beginning to realize that they had underestimated their foes in ways they couldn't have imagined. And in those skies above Europe, where the Luftwaffe once dominated, a new force was beginning to emerge. What started as mockery and laughter was slowly turning into a bitter realization. Something had shifted, and the Americans had just made their mark in a way no one had anticipated. The Thunderbolt, clumsy and slow in appearance, was now becoming a force that could not be ignored. The machines of men. Air power. Redefined. As the Germans scoffed at the Thunderbolt's design, American engineers had other plans. The P-47 was more than just a fighter. It was an evolution in industrial warfare. It was a monster designed to endure, to fight, and to survive. Qualities that would soon strike fear into the hearts of Luftwaffe pilots. The P-47 was born out of necessity during a time when the world's industrial might was at war. The year was 1940, and the German Blitzkrieg had swept across Europe with terrifying speed. The Luftwaffe was proving its dominance in the skies, and the Allies had no answer to their superior aircraft. But as the world struggled against the Axis powers, the United States began to recognize that it needed a fighter that could not only challenge the German fighters, but outlast them. It was in the heart of this global conflict that the vision for the P-47 was born. The man behind the Thunderbolt's design was Alexander Kartveli, a visionary engineer who had immigrated from Georgia in the 1920s. At Republic Aviation, Kartveli's goal wasn't to build a sleek, nimble interceptor like the Hing, German or British fighters. No, his ambition was to create a fighter that could outlast the Luftwaffe's best. The result was the P-47, a heavy, tough, and brutishly powerful aircraft that flew in defiance of the conventional wisdom of fighter design. The Germans, who had crafted their fighters for speed, agility, and quick kills, couldn't fathom the philosophy behind the P-47. The Thunderbolt's design was seen as a contradiction to everything the Luftwaffe had come to expect. The aircraft's bulky, muscular frame seemed to defy the principles of aerodynamics. The radial engine, bulky and inefficient by comparison to the sleek, liquid-cooled engines of the German fighters, was dismissed as a poor design choice. The P-47's heavy frame, combined with its robust armor and heavy armament, made it an aircraft that was hard to classify as a fighter. To many German pilots and engineers, it was little more than an oversized bomber disguised as a fighter. But what the Germans didn't understand was the genius of American industrial engineering. The P-47 wasn't meant to be the fastest or the most agile. It was designed to be a fighter that could survive. In the brutal attrition of war, survival meant everything. The Thunderbolt's design emphasized durability and firepower, two characteristics that would prove far more valuable in the long term than the fleeting advantages of speed and maneuverability. At the core of the Thunderbolt was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. This engine was the heart of the Thunderbolt, powering it to speeds that, while not exceptional, were still formidable for its size. The real strength, however, was its ability to maintain high power at altitude. While many of the Luftwaffe's fighters struggled as they climbed higher, the P-47 could maintain its power output well beyond the reach of most enemy aircraft. It could fight in the skies where German fighters, used to fighting at lower altitudes, had no advantage. But the Thunderbolt's power wasn't just in its engine. The aircraft was built like a tank. Its tough frame and durable construction allowed it to take a pounding that would send other aircraft tumbling from the sky. The thick steel plating behind the pilot's seat and around the engine protected the aircraft from cannon and machine gun fire. In a time when many fighters were constructed from lightweight materials, the P-47's toughness made it a flying fortress, one that could endure what the Germans could dish out and still return to fight another day. American pilots, still in their infancy in combat, were slow to adapt to the Thunderbolt's capabilities. Early in the war, they struggled with the plane's heavy frame and poor maneuverability, but those who persevered quickly discovered that the P-47 wasn't designed for traditional dogfights. It wasn't meant to climb, turn, and dive like the nimble Spitfire or Messerschmitt. Instead, it was a fighter that could power through the fight, take damage, and return fire with overwhelming force. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns delivered a devastating wall of lead. When a Thunderbolt pilot locked onto an enemy, the sheer volume of firepower coming from those guns could tear apart an aircraft in seconds. By mid-1943, the Thunderbolt had already begun to show its worth in combat. As American pilots gained experience and refined their tactics, the full potential of the P-47 began to emerge. While it couldn't turn with the nimble Focke-Wulf 190s, it could dive faster and hit harder. The P-47's firepower, combined with its durability, allowed American pilots to engage German fighters from positions of strength. In essence, it became a flying hammer, a blunt instrument of destruction that could strike with precision and force. And it was in these early, often brutal encounters that the Thunderbolt began to gain the respect it deserved. It wasn't just a flying milk bottle, it was a machine that could take punishment and still keep fighting. And that, more than anything else, would come to define the P-47. The Germans, who had initially mocked it, would soon find themselves confronted with something they could neither outmaneuver nor destroy easily. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a product of American industrial ingenuity, had begun to change the course of the war in the skies. It wasn't the fastest nor the most agile, but in the end, those qualities mattered less than the one thing the Thunderbolt had in abundance: the ability to survive. The Germans had underestimated the P-47, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. Laughter turns to terror. The first lessons learned. For months, German pilots believed the P-47 was too slow and clumsy to be a serious threat. But as the first Thunderbolts took damage and still returned to base, their enemies began to take notice. The laughter, once so certain, began to fade. These machines could survive what no other aircraft could. When the P-47 first arrived in Europe, it seemed an easy target for the veteran Luftwaffe pilots. To them, the Thunderbolt was little more than a flying tank, slow to climb, clumsy in turns, and bulky in the air. German pilots, accustomed to the quick maneuvering of the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190, saw the Thunderbolt as an oversized, awkward American experiment, an aircraft that would quickly be eliminated in a dogfight. The P-47's heavy frame and slow climb rate were seen as its primary weaknesses, and in the early days of the war, these weaknesses were exploited. The Germans dispatched their agile fighters with ease, knocking out Thunderbolts in the first few encounters. Yet, as the weeks wore on, something unexpected began to happen. The P-47s, despite their seeming clumsiness, began to return from combat with wounds that would have grounded any other aircraft. German pilots had fired everything they had: cannon shells, machine gun rounds, and bursts of concentrated fire. Yet, the Thunderbolts kept flying. One aircraft came back to base with over 200 bullet holes, its engine torn, its wings shredded, yet it flew home. Another pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, would later recall a mission where he took direct hits from a German fighter, only to see his aircraft stay in the air, damaged but still operational. The first signs of the P-47's true strength were in its survival ability. The heavy construction of its fuselage, its radial engine, and its thick armor made it a machine that could absorb punishment like no other fighter. Unlike the sleek, fragile German fighters which would crumple at the slightest hit, the Thunderbolt could take direct hits and keep going. It had a level of durability that defied the very expectations that the Germans had set. For the Germans, this realization came too late. They had dismissed the P-47 as a poor design, only to find that it could endure damage far beyond anything they had expected. The first encounters had been disastrous for the Americans, and the Germans had reasoned that the Thunderbolt's design flaws made it easy prey. But now, as the weeks passed and the P-47s continued to return to base with impossible damage, the Germans began to realize that this was no ordinary fighter. The consequences of this shift were immediate. The Luftwaffe, which had long prided itself on the skill of its pilots and the superiority of its aircraft, had begun to face an enemy that simply would not die. The Germans had come to rely on their speed and agility to take out Allied aircraft quickly, and now they were being forced to confront the reality that a new kind of fighter had entered the battlefield. The P-47 was not a machine that could be outmaneuvered or easily shot down. It was a machine designed to outlast its enemies, to take on the full weight of a fight, and to survive long enough to strike back. As the first Thunderbolts continued to defy expectations, the German pilots began to feel something that was as unfamiliar to them as it was terrifying: fear. What was once the subject of ridicule was now the source of genuine concern. The Thunderbolt's resilience and its raw firepower were no longer qualities to be laughed at. They were the very qualities that would soon change the course of the war. In the air, the balance of power was shifting. The P-47 pilots, who had once been green and inexperienced, were beginning to understand the true nature of their aircraft. They adapted their tactics, focusing on the strengths of the Thunderbolt, its ability to absorb damage, and its overwhelming firepower. Instead of engaging in tight dogfights, American pilots learned to exploit the P-47's strengths, using its heavy guns to destroy targets in a single pass, and using its durability to keep flying long after other aircraft would have fallen from the sky. The German pilots, once so confident in their superiority, found themselves on the defensive. They had expected to face an easy target, only to be confronted with an aircraft that could take punishment and keep fighting. The realization hit hard. The P-47 was not the slow, clumsy aircraft they had laughed at. It was a machine built to endure, to fight, and to win. By the summer of 1943, the Germans had begun to change their tactics in response to the Thunderbolt. They had underestimated the power of the American industrial machine, and now they were paying the price. The P-47s, which had once been mocked, had proven that they were not just survivors. They were weapons capable of turning the tide of war. As the months passed, the laughter of the Luftwaffe pilots grew quieter, replaced by the grim realization that the Thunderbolts were not going anywhere. The skies over Europe had become a battleground, and in this new war of attrition, it was the American machines that were winning. The Thunderbolts were no longer the joke of the skies. They were the terror of the Luftwaffe, and their enemies could no longer ignore them. The lessons learned from those first brutal encounters would define the future of air combat, and the Thunderbolt would be at the heart of it all. The unlikely hero, Major Donald Bliley's revelation. Major Donald Bliley, leading the 335th Fighter Squadron, was among the first to grasp the true potential of the P-47. In combat, the aircraft's heavy frame and vast firepower proved a challenge to conventional tactics. Bliley's insight, however, would lead his squadron to adapt and begin turning the tables on their German adversaries. Bliley's experience was unique. A veteran of the Royal Air Force's Eagle Squadron, he had seen his fair share of aerial combat. By the time he transitioned to the P-47, Bliley was well aware that fighting the Luftwaffe would require more than just the tactics used in the Spitfires and Hurricanes of his earlier days. The P-47 wasn't built for the same kind of dogfighting. While the British and German aircraft excelled in high-speed, high-agility turns and climbs, the Thunderbolt's heavy frame and massive radial engine made it far less nimble. Early encounters with the Luftwaffe had exposed the Thunderbolt's limitations, its inability to outclimb or outturn the German fighters. The P-47's massive size seemed to make it a sitting duck for the Luftwaffe's agile aces, especially when engaging in traditional dogfights. It quickly became clear that the Americans would have to rethink their approach to air combat if they were to be successful. It was Bliley, however, who began to see something that others missed. Instead of focusing on the P-47's weaknesses, he realized that the Thunderbolt's strength was in its durability and its sheer firepower. Bliley understood that while the P-47 may have lacked the agility of its opponents, it more than made up for it with its ability to absorb punishment and continue flying. The thick armor plating, reinforced wings, and rugged design meant that a Thunderbolt could take damage that would have torn other aircraft to pieces and still return to the fight. The P-47 wasn't meant to be delicate. It was meant to survive. Bliley's insight led to a radical shift in tactics. Instead of trying to outmaneuver the Luftwaffe, he encouraged his squadron to use the P-47's weight and power to their advantage. The heavy Thunderbolt was a diving machine, and in the hands of skilled pilots, it could reach speeds that left the German fighters helpless. The key, Bliley realized, was to use the P-47's superior dive speed and devastating firepower in a different way. The American pilots needed to avoid traditional dogfights altogether, and instead strike hard and fast from above, using the P-47's raw power to overwhelm the enemy before they had time to react. This shift in tactics was revolutionary. The Thunderbolts would climb to altitudes where the Luftwaffe pilots were less effective, gaining the upper hand by taking advantage of their aircraft's diving speed. The American pilots would then roll into a steep dive, reaching speeds of 500 miles per hour or more, faster than anything the Germans could hope to achieve. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns, set to converge at a distance of 300 yards, created an impenetrable zone of destruction. Once in range, the Germans had no chance. In a single pass, the Thunderbolts could lay down a storm of bullets that could tear apart a German fighter in seconds. The results were immediate. German pilots, accustomed to attacking from above or below, now found themselves on the receiving end of a concentrated, deadly barrage. The Thunderbolt's ability to deliver such firepower so quickly and with such precision turned the tide of the air battle. German pilots, once so confident in their superiority, began to feel the sting of American firepower. They were caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the attack and unable to adjust to the new tactics being employed by Blighley's squadron. By mid-1943, the impact of Blighley's strategy was becoming evident. The 335th Fighter Squadron, using Blighley's tactics, was racking up kills at an unprecedented rate. The Thunderbolt's ability to dive, attack, and then climb away to safety left the Luftwaffe pilots unable to adapt. Even when faced with multiple German fighters, the Americans could attack with overwhelming force and then escape before the Germans had a chance to regroup. It was a paradigm shift in the way air combat was fought, one that would forever change the course of the war in the skies. Blighley's leadership and tactical innovation gave the American pilots an edge they had not had before. His insight allowed the P-47's true potential to shine through, and it was a game-changer. As the months passed, more and more squadrons adopted Blighley's tactics, turning the P-47 into a force that the Germans could no longer ignore. What had once been a slow, clumsy fighter had transformed into a juggernaut of destruction, capable of taking on the most experienced pilots in the Luftwaffe and emerging victorious. The war in the skies was now a battle of endurance and firepower, not speed and agility. And it was Major Donald Blighley, with his visionary approach, who had unlocked the P-47's potential. His tactical genius would become the foundation for the Thunderbolt's dominance, and in doing so, he changed the way aerial warfare would be fought for the remainder of World War II. The laughter from the German pilots had stopped, replaced by something far more terrifying: respect. And it was Blighley who had led the way, showing the world that the P-47 was not just a fighter, it was a weapon that would reshape the skies over Europe. The birth of a juggernaut. Republic Aviation's gamble. When Republic Aviation was tasked with designing a high-altitude interceptor to match the German Luftwaffe, they never expected to produce a heavy, durable fighter. Yet, this dinosaur would become the cornerstone of American air superiority, a machine capable of delivering not just firepower, but a new way of thinking about aerial combat. In the early days of World War II, as the European conflict raged and the Luftwaffe proved its dominance in the skies, the United States recognized that it needed a fighter capable of taking on the best Germany had to offer. The question was, what kind of fighter should they build? Should they follow the design principles that favored speed, agility, and maneuverability, or take a different approach altogether? The answer came from Republic Aviation, which, under the guidance of chief designer Alexander Kartveli, began working on a fighter that would defy conventional expectations. Kartveli's vision was radical. Rather than producing a lightweight, nimble interceptor like the German Bf-19 or the British Spitfire, he designed a fighter that was massive, powerful, and built for survival in the harshest conditions. The P-47 Thunderbolt was conceived as a high-altitude, long-range fighter, one capable of not only matching the Luftwaffe's best, but enduring in a way that no other aircraft could. With its huge, robust radial engine, heavy frame, and thick armor, the P-47 was a far cry from the sleek fighters that had come before it. Republic Aviation had no intention of building a tank in the sky. They wanted to create a machine that could handle the most dangerous situations and survive when others would fall. To achieve this, the Thunderbolt was designed with toughness in mind. The P-47 was equipped with an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine that churned out 2,000 horsepower. This engine could provide the power necessary to maintain high speeds at altitude, where most other aircraft struggled. The P-47's rugged frame was reinforced with armor, and its wings were built to absorb the kind of punishment that would tear other planes apart. Despite the design's unorthodox nature, Republic aviation moved quickly. By 1940, the first prototype was flying. The aircraft was massive, its fuselage larger than anything the Germans had seen in a fighter. The engines were loud, the wings were thick, and the overall appearance was anything but graceful. It was no wonder that some critics called it a flying tank or a dinosaur. Even test pilots were uncertain, given its ungainly look and the questions surrounding its performance. Was this a mistake? Could such a heavy, powerful machine truly match the speed and maneuverability of the German fighters that had swept across Europe? But despite doubts and skepticism, the P-47 proved itself to be far more than the sum of its parts. Its sheer firepower was unlike anything seen before in a fighter. The Thunderbolt was armed with 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, far more than the standard armament of most fighters. Each of these guns could deliver a sustained barrage of bullets at an unprecedented rate, creating a wall of lead that would tear through enemy aircraft in a matter of seconds. The sheer number of rounds it could carry gave it a distinct advantage. It could keep firing for longer than any of its rivals, overwhelming enemy pilots with its relentless attack. As it became clear that the P-47 could survive punishment that would have grounded other planes, its reputation began to change. Early in combat, pilots were amazed at how many direct hits the Thunderbolt could take and still remain airworthy. Unlike the more delicate German aircraft, the P-47's heavy frame and durable construction meant it could return home even when riddled with bullet holes or torn apart by cannon fire. But it wasn't just toughness that made the Thunderbolt unique. It was its ability to use that toughness as a weapon. The P-47 wasn't a plane that needed to outmaneuver the enemy. It was a plane that could simply keep flying and firing no matter what. Yet, as impressive as the P-47's durability was, it wasn't without its flaws. Its massive size made it slower to climb and harder to maneuver than the Luftwaffe's more agile fighters. In the early months of combat, the Thunderbolt struggled to keep pace with the German machines. But American pilots, led by the likes of Major Donald Bliley, quickly adapted. They realized that the Thunderbolt didn't need to be agile. It just needed to be able to outlast the enemy and deliver devastating firepower when it counted. By learning to exploit its strengths, American pilots began to turn the tables on their German adversaries, showing that the P-47 was far more than a slow, clumsy target. In the months that followed, the P-47's role in the war expanded. It wasn't just an interceptor for high-altitude combat. It was a multi-role juggernaut. It began escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, providing cover for strategic raids over Europe. Its durability allowed it to fly longer missions, where its counterparts would have been forced to return home. As American pilots learned to adapt to the Thunderbolt's unique capabilities, the aircraft evolved from an untested prototype into one of the most feared weapons in the skies. Republic Aviation's gamble had paid off. The P-47, though mocked at first, had become the cornerstone of American air superiority in Europe. In a world dominated by sleek, fast fighters, the Thunderbolt had shown that raw power, durability, and firepower could be just as deadly, if not more so. What had begun as a heavy, unwieldy machine had transformed into a juggernaut capable of taking on the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. The P-47 Thunderbolt had found its place in the skies, and with it, the American air war had entered a new, far more destructive phase. Against all odds, Robert Johnson's legendary struggle, June 26, 1943. Over Lauzon, France, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson found himself trapped in a dying aircraft after being ambushed by a squadron of German fighters. With his P-47 torn apart, Johnson's survival defied belief. His resilience marked a turning point. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter. It was a force of nature. The mission had begun like any other, a routine bomber escort over occupied France. Johnson, part of the 61st Fighter Squadron, was flying in the tail of a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts, keeping watch for any signs of enemy fighters. The Americans had only been in combat for a few months, but the P-47's firepower and durability had already earned it a reputation among the Luftwaffe pilots. On this day, however, the odds were stacked against Johnson. The Germans had a perfect opportunity to strike, and they did so with brutal precision. Without warning, the skies over Lazo erupted in chaos. A squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s, superior in speed and maneuverability, dove from the sun and descended on the unsuspecting American formation. Johnson's P-47 was immediately engulfed in a hailstorm of enemy fire. The German pilots were relentless, weaving in and out of his line of sight, firing their cannons and machine guns with devastating accuracy. In a matter of moments, Johnson's Thunderbolt was shredded by their attack. The canopy shattered, and shrapnel tore through the cockpit, wounding Johnson in the leg and face. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cabin, and flames erupted from the engine. The tail was badly damaged, and his controls were quickly becoming unresponsive. Johnson's situation was dire. With his vision blurred by blood and smoke, his aircraft trembling under the force of enemy fire, and his chances of survival rapidly diminishing, he was faced with an impossible choice: bail out or attempt to bring his aircraft home. For a brief moment, he considered the idea of abandoning the plane, but something inside him refused to give up. The P-47 was built to survive, and in that moment, so was he. Despite the overwhelming odds, Johnson fought to keep his aircraft in the air, using his remaining control to level out and maintain altitude. The power of the Thunderbolt's engine, though damaged, kept the plane flying, defying what should have been a certain crash. But his fight wasn't over yet. As Johnson struggled to regain control, a lone German fighter came into view, seeing the crippled P-47 as an easy target. The German pilot opened fire at close range, sending a deadly barrage of 20mm cannon rounds into Johnson's aircraft. The hits were catastrophic. A cannon shell exploded near his seat, and the structure of his P-47 began to disintegrate. Yet, miraculously, Johnson's Thunderbolt kept flying, its heavy frame absorbing the damage that would have brought any other aircraft to the ground. Now, nearly incapacitated and with his controls barely responding, Johnson was unable to escape the pursuit of the enemy fighter. But as the German pilot closed in for another attack, something remarkable happened. The German plane, after firing another burst into Johnson's aircraft, pulled up alongside the wounded Thunderbolt. For a moment, the two pilots locked eyes. Johnson, despite his injuries, managed to see the look of confusion on the German's face, a mix of disbelief and hesitation. The German pilot, unable to understand how Johnson's plane was still flying after taking such brutal punishment, gave a small salute and peeled away, leaving Johnson to limp back to Allied territory. Incredibly, Johnson managed to fly his shattered aircraft back to England, where he landed at Manston Airfield. The crew chief who met him at the runway was speechless as he counted the bullet holes in Johnson's P-47, stopping only after reaching 200. The aircraft had endured more damage than any fighter should have been able to handle and still returned home. Johnson, though battered and bloodied, had survived against all odds, and his legendary struggle became one of the defining moments of the P-47's mythos. For the Allies, this incident was a revelation. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been regarded as a durable, heavy fighter, capable of absorbing damage and returning fire with overwhelming force. But it was Johnson's story, his battle to keep the plane flying despite catastrophic damage, that cemented the Thunderbolt's reputation as a machine that could defy the laws of aviation. It wasn't just that the Thunderbolt was tough, it was that it could take more punishment than any other fighter and still remain a force to be reckoned with. In the months following Johnson's miraculous return, the P-47's image underwent a profound transformation. No longer was it seen merely as a heavy, unwieldy fighter. It was now regarded as a nearly indestructible juggernaut, capable of withstanding more punishment than any other aircraft. The Thunderbolt had proven itself not only as a weapon of destruction, but as a symbol of American industrial might and resilience. It was no longer just a tool of war. It was a force that could endure anything the enemy threw at it and keep fighting. Johnson's story spread throughout the Allied forces, becoming a rallying cry for pilots and ground crews alike. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become a machine of legend, a symbol of hope for the American war effort. The Germans, once dismissive of the American fighter, were now facing an adversary they could not ignore. The skies over Europe were no longer theirs to command, and the Thunderbolt had proven that the Allies had arrived with a weapon unlike any other. The myth of invulnerability, the P-47, survives the impossible. When Robert Johnson's Thunderbolt returned to base, riddled with over 200 bullet holes, it was clear that the P-47 was something different. German pilots could scarcely believe that an aircraft so damaged could keep flying, let alone return to fight another day. The reality of its durability had set in, and with it, fear. The P-47 Thunderbolt had always been regarded as a tough fighter, built with the kind of ruggedness needed to survive the brutal attrition of aerial warfare. But nothing highlighted its durability more than the harrowing return of Johnson's crippled aircraft. It wasn't just a matter of survival. It was about resilience on a scale the Luftwaffe had never encountered. The P-47 had proven that it could endure damage that would have grounded any other plane, and yet still return to fight again. Johnson's P-47 was far from the only example of the Thunderbolt's extraordinary toughness. Over the following months, more and more reports began to surface of Thunderbolts returning to base with seemingly impossible levels of damage. The heavy armor, the radial engine, and the tough frame had been designed to absorb punishment. But no one had expected it to be this effective. These aircraft weren't just flying machines. They were instruments of survival, engineered to face the harshest conditions and keep going. Time and again, Thunderbolts were shot to pieces, yet their pilots brought them home. One particularly striking example occurred during a mission in August 1943, when Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, one of the leading American aces, engaged a squadron of German fighters over the skies of France. His P-47 took multiple hits, yet Gabreski's plane remained airborne, defying the odds. After landing, engineers discovered that his aircraft had taken over 100 rounds of 20mm cannon fire. Despite the damage to its wings and fuselage, the Thunderbolt had continued to fly, and Gabreski had been able to complete his mission and return to base. Incredibly, it wasn't just the aircraft that withstood the punishment. The pilots themselves did as well. The P-47's tough construction wasn't limited to its outer shell. Inside, the cockpit was fortified with thick steel plating, designed to protect the pilot from enemy fire. It was the kind of protection that allowed pilots to endure some of the most dangerous skies of the war. In contrast to the fragile German fighters, which often left their pilots vulnerable to a single hit, the P-47 provided a shield that turned the tables in the cockpit. For the Germans, this was a new and unsettling reality. German pilots, seasoned and confident in their ability to outmaneuver Allied aircraft, could scarcely believe their eyes when Thunderbolts returned with severe damage but still stayed in the fight. They had expected the P-47 to be an easy target, a slow-moving, clumsy fighter. Instead, it became a weapon of terror, a machine that absorbed hits and kept coming. The mental toll of facing an adversary like this was profound. It wasn't just about outwitting or outgunning the enemy. It was about realizing that the Thunderbolt didn't have the same vulnerabilities as their own fighters. No matter how much they shot it, the P-47 wouldn't fall like the others. By late 1943, as more Thunderbolts began to return to base with damage that should have been fatal, German commanders began to take note. They had underestimated the American aircraft in every conceivable way. It wasn't just that the Thunderbolt could take damage, it was that it could continue operating in conditions that would have grounded any other fighter. Its rugged design and the durability of its radial engine made it the ideal tool for long-range missions. American pilots had started to realize that they didn't need to rely on speed or agility. They just needed to outlast the enemy. In fact, this realization was a turning point in the broader strategic battle between the Luftwaffe and the Allies. The German strategy of quick, decisive air superiority was challenged by the reality that American fighters could survive long enough to create lasting damage. The Germans, accustomed to fighting against aircraft that could be easily crippled, were now confronted with a foe that would not break, no matter how much force was applied. In the skies over Europe, the P-47 was evolving into something more than just a fighter. It was a symbol of industrial might, a weapon that showcased the resilience of not just the aircraft but also the people who built and flew it. For the Luftwaffe, every encounter with the Thunderbolt became a reminder of their own vulnerability. The fear that crept into their ranks was not simply about the aircraft's firepower but its ability to endure and to return with a vengeance. By the end of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a machine to be underestimated. It was a force in its own right, a fighter that could take more punishment than any of its adversaries and still be capable of delivering devastation. The myth of invulnerability had taken root, and with it, the understanding that the war in the skies over Europe had fundamentally changed. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a survivor, it was a juggernaut, capable of reshaping the course of the conflict. And in the minds of the Luftwaffe pilots who faced it, the Thunderbolt had become a symbol of something far worse than just a machine. It had become a nightmare that would not go away. The Thunderbolt's terrifying guns, a wall of lead. What made the Thunderbolt so dangerous wasn't just its durability, it was its armament. With 8-50 caliber Browning machine guns, the Thunderbolt could deliver a staggering amount of firepower in a single pass. For the Luftwaffe, this sustained barrage of bullets became the ultimate nightmare. The P-47 Thunderbolt's armament was nothing short of overwhelming. Unlike its German counterparts, which typically carried either a few large caliber cannon or smaller machine guns, the Thunderbolt was built to flood the air with bullets. Each of its 8-50 caliber machine guns was capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, creating a virtual wall of lead in front of the aircraft. This relentless barrage of heavy machine gun fire was the P-47's signature weapon, and it was the thing that would come to terrify German pilots more than anything else. The sheer volume of firepower was the key to the Thunderbolt's effectiveness. Most fighters, including the agile Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190, relied on precision shots to bring down an enemy aircraft. In contrast, the P-47 didn't need perfect accuracy. The combined weight of its guns and the continuous stream of bullets created a probability cloud of projectiles that would shred an enemy aircraft even if the aim was slightly off. No longer was it enough for the pilot to make a clean shot. The Thunderbolt's guns were designed to overwhelm, saturating the air with lead at ranges that the German fighters could not escape. This was not just an advantage in terms of firepower, it was a psychological weapon. German pilots who had grown used to the precision of their aircraft's cannons found themselves unable to escape the thunderous barrage of the P-47. The 50 caliber rounds didn't just create small holes in their aircraft. They tore through wings, fuselages, and engines with the kind of violence that left little hope for the enemy. A German fighter, once caught in the Thunderbolt's gun sight, was facing not just an opponent, but an impenetrable wall of fire that would tear them apart in seconds. The impact on Luftwaffe pilots was profound. Unlike their own fighters, which required skill and careful aim to take down an opponent, the Thunderbolt's firepower could bring down a German plane even in a hurried, unrefined attack. It didn't matter if the shots were slightly off target. Within seconds, the German aircraft would be overwhelmed by the volume of fire, reducing it to flaming wreckage. The P-47's guns created a lethal zone of destruction, a 300-yard wide swath of lead that no German pilot dared to fly through. Even more terrifying was the Thunderbolt's ability to sustain that fire for longer than any other fighter. Most German aircraft, which carried far fewer rounds, were limited in how long they could keep up a continuous attack. The P-47, however, could unleash over 3,400 rounds of ammunition in a single pass, more than enough to tear apart a whole formation of enemy planes. When combined with the heavy armor and resilient design of the Thunderbolt, its armament made it the most fearsome fighter in the air. American pilots quickly learned how to use this devastating armament to their advantage. The P-47 was not designed for dogfighting, where agility and tight turns could win the day. Instead, its pilots employed a tactic known as boom and zoom, which allowed them to use their superior dive speed to attack from above. The heavy firepower of the Thunderbolt ensured that once the Germans were caught in its sights, there was no escape. Once locked on, the Thunderbolt pilot would dive in, unload a devastating stream of bullets, and then climb away to safety before the enemy could retaliate. The damage caused by the P-47's guns was catastrophic. When German pilots survived an encounter with the Thunderbolt, their reports were filled with disbelief at the destruction they had witnessed. In a single pass, a P-47 could disintegrate an entire aircraft, reducing it to a cloud of metal fragments. The concentrated firepower was so intense that it didn't just bring down enemy planes, it obliterated them. The Thunderbolt's firepower was more than just an offensive weapon. It was a force of nature, capable of transforming the sky into a deadly battlefield where survival was nearly impossible for those caught in its line of fire. For the Luftwaffe, the sound of a Thunderbolt's guns was a harbinger of doom. The Germans had grown used to the crack of machine guns, but the sustained roar of the Thunderbolt's 850 calibers was a sound unlike any other. It wasn't the quick, sharp bursts of their own weapons. It was a continuous, deafening barrage that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The psychological toll on the German pilots was immense. Every time a P-47 appeared, it wasn't just a matter of evading fire. It was a matter of surviving an overwhelming force that could shatter their planes with a few well-placed bursts. By the time the Allies reached the skies over Normandy in June 1944, the Thunderbolt's reputation was sealed. It wasn't just the durability or the firepower. It was the combination of both, creating a fighter that was almost unstoppable. The Thunderbolt had become a living nightmare for the Luftwaffe, a wall of lead that none of their aircraft could withstand. And as the war raged on, the Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns would continue to tear through the German ranks, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Turning the tide, the evolution of American tactics. By the summer of 1943, the Thunderbolts had begun to find their rhythm. American pilots, learning from their early encounters, developed new tactics to exploit the P-47's strengths and counter its weaknesses. The era of the flying milk bottle was over. The Thunderbolt had become a hunter in the sky. At first, the P-47 had been seen as a liability, too slow to climb, too heavy to turn, and too cumbersome in dogfights. Early missions in 1943 highlighted these flaws, with many American pilots struggling to keep pace with the nimble German fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots, with their sleek and agile Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, had no difficulty exploiting these weaknesses, often ambushing the Thunderbolts with superior speed and maneuverability. The early months were a series of hard lessons for the 8th and 9th Air Forces, and the American pilots had to adapt quickly if they were going to survive. However, as the war in the skies continued, something extraordinary began to happen. American pilots, seasoned by combat, started to understand the true nature of their aircraft. The Thunderbolt was never meant to be the agile, high-speed dogfighter that the Luftwaffe so excelled in. Instead, it was a machine built for a different kind of fight, one that involved endurance, firepower, and strategic positioning. The first step in this transformation came when pilots realized they didn't need to engage in traditional dogfights. The key to surviving in the P-47 was learning how to leverage its raw power and devastating armament without getting drawn into maneuvers that favored the more nimble German fighters. Major Donald Bliley of the 335th Fighter Squadron was one of the first to recognize this shift in tactics. His initial understanding of the P-47's capabilities, shaped by his experience with the RAF's Eagle Squadron, led him to develop what would become the defining tactic for the Thunderbolt: boom and zoom. Instead of trying to engage the enemy in tight, circular dogfights where the P-47's size and lack of agility put it at a disadvantage, Bliley encouraged his pilots to use the Thunderbolt's exceptional dive speed and firepower. The idea was simple: climb to higher altitudes where the German fighters were less effective, then dive down on the enemy with overwhelming speed and firepower, delivering a concentrated burst of machine gun fire before climbing back up to safety. This tactic became the hallmark of the P-47's combat effectiveness. By diving from high altitudes, the Thunderbolts could strike at German fighters with speeds that exceeded their enemy's own aircraft, even in a vertical dive. The Luftwaffe pilots, unable to respond quickly enough to the sheer speed and firepower of the Thunderbolts, found themselves in a deadly trap. Once the Thunderbolt pilots locked onto their targets, there was little the Germans could do to evade the deluge of 50 caliber bullets that would tear apart their aircraft in a matter of seconds. The boom and zoom tactic not only made the Thunderbolts deadly to individual German aircraft, but it also changed the nature of air combat over Europe. No longer were the P-47s at the mercy of the Luftwaffe's maneuverability. Instead, they became predators, capable of striking at will and disengaging before the Germans had a chance to mount a counterattack. This new approach gave the Thunderbolt pilots a distinct advantage, and as they honed their skills in these tactics, their effectiveness in combat grew exponentially. By the summer of 1943, American pilots were beginning to recognize that the Thunderbolt's real strength lay not in dogfighting, but in its ability to control the skies through power and firepower. As they refined their tactics, they also learned how to use the P-47's heavy frame and armament to survive the harshest encounters. The P-47, once mocked as an ungainly flying milk bottle, had evolved into a highly effective, resilient, and feared weapon in the skies. German pilots who had once dismissed the Thunderbolt as easy prey began to respect the Thunderbolt's power and firepower. They learned, often the hard way, that the P-47's toughness and relentless guns made it a formidable adversary. In the ensuing months, the tactics refined by Bliley and other experienced American pilots would be passed down to new pilots arriving in Europe. As more Thunderbolts arrived in the theater, they were flown by pilots who had learned from the mistakes of the early days, making them deadlier with each mission. These new tactics, combined with the P-47's durability and firepower, meant that the Luftwaffe would now have to contend with a new kind of opponent, one that could take punishment and deliver devastating blows in return. By the fall of 1943, the Thunderbolt was no longer a laughingstock. The era of the flying milk bottle was over. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become a hunter in the sky, a machine that could outlast, overpower, and destroy the Luftwaffe's finest fighters. The Germans had underestimated the Americans in the early months of the war, but by mid-1943, They had learned to their horror that the Thunderbolt was no ordinary fighter. It was a force that would help turn the tide of the air war in Europe, the thunderclap, the sound of doom. It wasn't just the Thunderbolt's power that terrorized German pilots. It was the sound. The thundering roar of the Thunderbolt's engine and its deafening gunfire became a signature of impending doom. For those who had heard it, there was no mistaking it. Death had arrived from above. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast in the sky, and its presence was marked by an unmistakable, ear-splitting roar. The massive, 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine that powered the Thunderbolt made a noise like no other aircraft. Its deep, throaty growl could be heard long before the fighter came into view. As it approached, the sound grew louder, unmistakably powerful, unrelenting, and ominous. For German pilots, the very sound of the Thunderbolt's engine was a harbinger of doom. The skies would shake with its thunderous growl, a warning that the enemy was near, and a reminder that no matter how fast they were, no matter how agile, they were no match for the firepower and resilience of the P-47. For American pilots, the engine was a source of pride. It was the heart of the Thunderbolt, the power that allowed them to dive at incredible speeds, climb above their adversaries, and unleash an unrelenting barrage of gunfire. The engine's unmistakable roar was a signal to them that they had the power to take on anything the Germans could throw at them. The Thunderbolt's deep, resonating engine noise became a symbol of American strength in the air, loud, unyielding, and unstoppable. But for the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare. German pilots had grown accustomed to the high-pitched whine of their own fighters, the sleek Bf-109s, or the more powerful Focke-Wulf 190s. The sound of those aircraft was swift, sharp, and deadly, but the Thunderbolt's engine carried a different kind of menace, a guttural, menacing rumble that seemed to promise only one thing: destruction. Yet, it wasn't just the sound of the engine that made the Thunderbolt so terrifying. It was the noise of its guns, the deafening roar of its .850 caliber Browning machine guns that would shatter the silence of the sky. The P-47 could unleash a torrent of bullets in a matter of seconds, filling the air with a continuous burst of firepower. To the unprepared German pilot, this wall of bullets was unlike anything they had encountered before. The Thunderbolt's guns didn't just create a quick, sharp burst of sound. They created a constant, overwhelming roar that never seemed to stop. It was as if the Thunderbolt itself was screaming as it dove into the attack, each shot a deafening cry for vengeance. And once those guns opened up, the German pilots had only seconds to react before their planes were torn apart. For those who had faced the P-47 in combat, the sound of its guns left an indelible mark. In the frantic moments before an attack, when the Germans realized they were in the Thunderbolt's sights, the deafening sound of the gunfire became a signal that escape was impossible. The high-pitched crackle of smaller guns was nothing compared to the thunderous barrage of the Thunderbolt's 8 machine guns. The sustained roar of fire as the American pilots unleashed their full salvo into enemy formations was enough to shatter any hope of survival. German pilots, who were used to the precision of their own weapons, found themselves helpless against the overwhelming power of the Thunderbolt's guns. There was no way to evade the constant storm of lead that the Thunderbolt could deliver. It wasn't just a quick hit and run, it was a relentless assault, a continuous barrage that never seemed to stop. The psychological toll of facing the Thunderbolt was immense. The sound of the Thunderbolt's engine as it approached, deep, unrelenting, and heavy, struck fear into the hearts of the German pilots. They had come to know that this was no ordinary fighter. This wasn't a quick, nimble enemy they could outmaneuver. It was a machine that could take hits, keep fighting, and unleash a deadly wall of firepower that could tear them apart in seconds. And when they heard that thunderous roar, they knew that death was closing in from above. For the American pilots, The sound of their own Thunderbolt was a reassurance. It was the sound of strength, power, and resilience, qualities that were becoming synonymous with the Thunderbolt itself. But for the Germans, it was a terrifying reminder that they were facing a new kind of warfare, one where durability and firepower overcame speed and agility. The Thunderbolt had turned the tables on the Luftwaffe, and with each new encounter, the sound of its approach only reinforced the reality that the skies over Europe were no longer the domain of the Luftwaffe. By the time of the D-Day invasion in June 1944, the sound of the Thunderbolt had become an iconic symbol of American dominance in the air. It was a constant reminder of the industrial might behind the American war effort and the terrifying power of the Thunderbolt. For those who had fought against it, the Thunderbolt's roar remained a ghostly memory, one that haunted their nightmares long after the war ended. In the end, it wasn't just the Thunderbolt's firepower that made it feared. It was the relentless, thundering sound that came to signify the arrival of doom. The game changer, Major David Schilling's Gambit. On August 17, 1943, Major David Schilling led the 62nd Fighter Squadron on a mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg, targeting German industrial sites. It was there, in the heart of Nazi Germany, that the P-47's true potential became clear. In a high-speed dive, it could rip through enemy formations with ease, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. This mission, part of a larger Allied offensive aimed at crippling Germany's industrial capacity, marked a pivotal moment in the development of the Thunderbolt as a war-winning machine. Up until that point, the P-47 had proven its resilience and firepower, but its true capabilities in a deep penetration rate were still untested. Schilling's mission, a daring strike at the heart of Germany, would demonstrate that the P-47 was not only a formidable force in escort missions or tactical ground strikes, but a game-changer in strategic raids as well. The mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg was fraught with risks. American bombers were deep inside enemy territory, flying over a landscape heavily defended by the Luftwaffe. German fighter squadrons were already on high alert, ready to intercept the American formations before they could reach their targets. The 62nd Fighter Squadron, tasked with providing fighter cover, would be flying into the heart of enemy airspace, where the threat of attack was almost certain. The Germans were known for their aggressive counterattacks, and the Allied fighters needed to neutralize the threat as quickly as possible. As Schilling's Thunderbolts approached the target, the Luftwaffe sprung into action, sending waves of enemy fighters to intercept the bombers. But the Thunderbolts, with their heavier armament and superior firepower, were prepared. Schilling led his squadron into the fray, diving into the German formations with deadly precision. As the P-47s plummeted toward the enemy, the immense speed and power of the aircraft allowed them to tear through the Luftwaffe squadrons with devastating effect. The high-speed dive was the P-47's greatest advantage. While the German fighters were quick and nimble in level flight, they were no match for the Thunderbolt when it came to diving attacks. The P-47 could reach speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour in a dive, faster than anything the Germans could hope to match. As Schilling and his pilots dove into the fray, the enemy formations broke apart under the barrage of 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns. The Thunderbolt's relentless gunfire turned German fighters into fireballs, their fuselages torn apart in seconds. The sheer volume of ammunition fired, combined with the immense speed of the attack, left the German fighters with little time to react. In those moments, the Thunderbolt became a juggernaut, capable of cutting through the Luftwaffe with brutal efficiency. The Germans had no answer for the P-47's ability to dive, attack, and then climb back into the sky, ready to strike again. Schilling's tactics, the boom and zoom, had become a hallmark of Thunderbolt combat, a strategy that allowed the P-47 to maximize its strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. No longer did the Thunderbolts need to engage in slow, methodical dogfights. They could strike fast and hard, overwhelming the Germans before they had time to mount a defense. The results of the raid were staggering. The P-47s destroyed German fighters in mere seconds, often before the enemy pilots could even respond. The Thunderbolts' powerful armament and high-speed dive turned the tide of the air battle, forcing the Luftwaffe to retreat and allowing the bombers to complete their mission with minimal losses. The devastation left in the wake of the P-47s was felt across the Luftwaffe, signaling the beginning of a new chapter in the air war over Europe. The success of Schilling's mission had far-reaching implications. It proved once and for all that the Thunderbolt was not just a fighter for defensive operations or escort duties, it was a weapon capable of transforming the course of a battle. By using its massive firepower, dive speed, and resilience, the Thunderbolt had become a weapon of choice for Allied strategic operations. The Germans, once confident in their ability to disrupt Allied raids, now had to contend with an adversary that could hit them hard and fast, leaving destruction in its wake before they could even respond. In the aftermath of the Schweinfurt and Regensburg raid, the Thunderbolt's reputation was solidified. The flying milk bottle had shed its old image as a slow, cumbersome target and had become a fearsome predator in the skies. Schilling's tactical ingenuity and the P-47's immense capabilities demonstrated that, in the right hands, the Thunderbolt was more than just a survivor. It was a game-changing force capable of striking fear into the heart of the Luftwaffe. The success of the mission marked a turning point, and it was clear that the Thunderbolt would play a central role in the Allied war effort, not only in escorting bombers, but also in delivering devastating blows to the heart of Nazi Germany. For the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt's appearance over enemy territory was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a warning. The game had changed, and the skies over Europe now belonged to the Allies. The fatal encounter. The P-47 versus German fighters. The Thunderbolt's performance at high altitude soon became a devastating advantage over German fighters. While German planes struggled for air in the thinning skies, the Thunderbolt soared above them, a relentless force that shattered any hope the Luftwaffe had of maintaining air superiority. By 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had firmly established itself as a pivotal player in the air war over Europe. Its powerful engine, rugged design, and overwhelming firepower gave it a distinct edge. But it was at high altitudes where the Thunderbolt truly began to shine. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by the demands of multiple fronts, had to fight in increasingly difficult conditions. As the war progressed, German pilots found themselves facing an enemy aircraft that not only outlasted them in combat, but could also take the fight to them in their own domain, the skies above. At altitudes of 25,000 feet and higher, the performance of the Luftwaffe's primary fighters, such as the Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, began to degrade. The thinner air made it harder for these planes to maintain the maneuverability and speed that had once given them such an advantage. As they struggled to climb, the P-47, with its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, soared higher and faster. The Thunderbolt had been specifically designed for such high-altitude engagements, where the air was thinner and the stakes were much higher. The P-47's ability to hold its power at these altitudes gave it the upper hand in almost every encounter. On a mission over northern France in late summer 1943, the disparity between the P-47 and the Luftwaffe's fighters became painfully evident. A group of Thunderbolts, led by Major Robert Gaylor, was escorting a group of B-17 bombers when they encountered a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s. The German fighters had come from below, diving in to attack the bombers, but the P-47s were already positioned at a higher altitude, waiting for them. Gaylor's Thunderbolts, with their superior altitude, were able to dive down onto the Focke-Wulfs with devastating force. What followed was a one-sided engagement that would send shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. The way German fighters, struggling to climb back to altitude, found themselves trapped. As the P-47s dove down, they unleashed their 850 caliber machine guns, creating a storm of lead that the German fighters could not escape. In moments, the Luftwaffe's best pilots were forced to evade or be destroyed, their planes riddled with bullet holes or disintegrating under the sheer power of the Thunderbolt's fire. The Focke-Wulf 190s, once considered some of the most formidable fighters in the world, were now being hunted by a machine that not only outperformed them at altitude, but also overpowered them in terms of firepower. The terror the P-47 instilled in German pilots was not just because of its devastating firepower, it was because the Thunderbolt had become a predator in the sky, able to strike at will and disappear before the enemy could respond. German pilots, who once ruled the skies with their superior maneuverability, now had to contend with a fighter that could dive with precision, unleash a torrent of gunfire, and climb away before they had time to retaliate. The P-47's versatility had transformed it into a machine that could adapt to any combat scenario, but at high altitudes, it was a game changer. For the Luftwaffe, this change in the air war was a hard blow. Their ace pilots, who had previously dominated the skies with their superior tactics and speed, now found themselves being outclassed by a more resilient, relentless enemy. The Thunderbolt, once dismissed as slow and cumbersome, had become an aircraft that could engage and destroy its adversaries from a position of strength, and the Germans were struggling to keep up. This was no longer just a war of attrition, it was a war of adaptation, and the P-47 was evolving faster than the Luftwaffe could respond. In one particular encounter over the skies of France, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, one of the top American aces, faced off against a German squadron of Bf-109s. Gabreski's P-47 was damaged by enemy fire, but he managed to push his aircraft to its limits, using the Thunderbolt's durability and power to engage the Germans in a high-altitude dogfight. Despite the damage, Gabreski's Thunderbolt proved impossible to defeat. The Germans, unable to outmaneuver him at altitude, were forced to retreat, leaving Gabreski victorious. The victory was a testament not only to Gabreski's skill, but also to the Thunderbolt's dominance in high-altitude combat. By the end of 1943, the Germans had fully grasped what they were up against. The Thunderbolt was no longer the slow, clumsy target they had once thought it to be. It had become a machine that could dominate the skies from above, utilizing its raw power, firepower, and resilience to systematically break apart the Luftwaffe's defenses. The Thunderbolt's performance at high altitudes had reshaped the rules of engagement, and the Luftwaffe was now on the defensive. For the Allies, it was a turning point. The P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged not just as a durable fighter, but as a weapon capable of controlling the skies. It was no longer a question of holding ground, it was a question of domination. The Thunderbolt had proven that in the right hands, it could overcome any challenge, and it was this new era of air superiority that would define the Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. The sky no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. It was now the domain of the Thunderbolt. Philipp's last stand. A German ace. Falls on October 8, 1943, one of Germany's most successful aces, Hans Philipp, encountered a Thunderbolt while leading a squadron in a mission over Bremond, France. The engagement ended with the loss of Philipp's life, marking a turning point in the war. The Thunderbolts had made their mark, and they weren't going anywhere. Hans Philipp was no ordinary pilot. By the fall of 1943, he had racked up 106 kills, making him one of the most accomplished aces in the Luftwaffe. He was a veteran of numerous battles and had honed his skills in some of the most intense dogfights over Europe. Philip's reputation preceded him, and his name alone instilled fear in Allied pilots. He was known for his precise, calculated attacks and his ability to quickly turn the tide in his favor. For him, the skies over France were familiar, a place where he had bested countless opponents. But on that day, as he led a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s on a mission to intercept Allied bombers, he would come face to face with a new and deadly adversary. The Americans had recently begun to deploy the P-47 Thunderbolt in increasing numbers. Up until then, German pilots had dismissed the Thunderbolt as slow, awkward, and unsuitable for the kind of high-speed combat they had grown accustomed to. But as the war raged on, and as Thunderbolt pilots adapted their tactics, the aircraft had begun to demonstrate its true potential. By October 1943, the Thunderbolt was no longer the clumsy target it had once seemed. It had become a predator, and it was about to show Philip just how dangerous it could be. Philip and his squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s had spotted a group of American B-17 bombers and were preparing to engage. They flew in tight formation, intending to intercept the bombers and destroy them before they could reach their targets. However, what they hadn't accounted for was the presence of the Thunderbolts, which had been tasked with escorting the bombers. As Philip and his squadron dove toward the B-17s, a group of Thunderbolts appeared from above, positioning themselves in the perfect place to intercept the German fighters. Major Robert Johnson, a seasoned P-47 pilot, was part of the escorting Thunderbolts. His squadron was well versed in the tactics required to deal with German aces like Philip. Johnson knew that the key to taking down a skilled adversary like Philip was not to engage in a traditional dogfight, but to use the Thunderbolt's firepower and durability to strike decisively and quickly. The P-47 was no longer the awkward, slow-moving fighter it had once been. It had become a highly efficient predator, capable of delivering a devastating blow before the enemy could react. As Philip's squadron made their attack on the B-17s, Johnson and his fellow pilots dove in, cutting through the German formation with terrifying speed. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns opened up, sending a wall of lead tearing through the sky. Philip, experienced as he was, attempted to break the American assault, but he was outclassed by the Thunderbolt's power and precision. In the chaos of the attack, he found himself separated from his squadron, vulnerable to the Thunderbolt's superior position and firepower. What happened next was quick and brutal. Philip's Focke-Wulf was hit by a barrage of 50 caliber bullets, tearing through the aircraft's wings and fuselage. Despite his best efforts to regain control, the damage was too severe. As his plane went into a tailspin, Philip attempted to bail out, but he was unable to escape in time. His aircraft plunged to the ground, a fiery wreckage that marked the end of one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled and feared aces. The loss of Hans Philipp sent shockwaves through the German ranks, signaling a shift in the balance of power in the skies over Europe. For the Allies, Philipp's death was a symbol of the changing tide of the war. The Thunderbolt, which had once been dismissed as a cumbersome fighter, had proven itself capable of taking on the Luftwaffe's best pilots and emerging victorious. Philipp's death was more than just the loss of an individual. It was a testament to the evolving tactics and increasing effectiveness of the P-47. The Thunderbolt was no longer just an escort fighter. It had become a weapon capable of confronting the most skilled German aces and defeating them. The engagement over Bremen was a turning point, not just for the P-47, but for the entire Allied air effort. The Thunderbolts had shown that they could dominate the skies and take on the Luftwaffe in ways that had once seemed impossible. Philipp's death symbolized the broader shift in the air war. No longer was the Luftwaffe the uncontested master of the skies over Europe. The Thunderbolt, with its firepower, resilience, and evolving tactics, had become a serious threat to the once dominant German air forces. As the war progressed, the Thunderbolts would continue to play a crucial role in the Allied victory. The lessons learned from engagements like the one over Bremen would shape the course of the air war, and the P-47 would be at the forefront of that evolution. The loss of Hans Philipp marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's dominance, and it was clear that the Thunderbolt was a weapon that the Germans could no longer afford to underestimate. The D-22, a new era in Thunderbolt power. By 1944, the P-47 was undergoing significant upgrades, including the arrival of the D-22 model, which featured a new propeller that dramatically improved performance. Suddenly, the once clumsy fighter could keep up with the Luftwaffe's best. It wasn't just a bomber escort anymore. It was an all-around killing machine. The P-47 Thunderbolt had already proven itself as a resilient and powerful fighter by 1944, but its transformation into a true powerhouse in the air was far from complete. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame, while initially seen as a weakness, had become a strength. It could take damage and keep flying when other planes would have been grounded. The 850 caliber machine guns mounted on its wings gave it overwhelming firepower, and its rugged design allowed it to survive intense combat. However, the one lingering issue that had plagued the Thunderbolt throughout its career was its agility, or rather, its lack of it. The P-47's large size and weight made it slow to climb and difficult to maneuver in a dogfight, leaving it at a disadvantage against the more nimble Luftwaffe fighters, such as the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190. Enter the D-22 model of the P-47. By late 1943 and early 1944, Republic Aviation began to upgrade the Thunderbolt, most notably with the introduction of a new, more efficient propeller. The new paddle blade propeller increased the Thunderbolt's overall performance, giving it a much-needed boost in terms of speed and climb rate. This improvement made the P-47 more versatile and capable of engaging in a wider variety of combat scenarios. The new propeller increased the Thunderbolt's maximum speed to over 430 miles per hour, a marked improvement over earlier models, and made it more competitive with the Luftwaffe's best. The Thunderbolt's new performance capabilities didn't just enhance its bomber escort role. They elevated the P-47 to a level where it could take on the German fighters head-to-head in aerial combat. With the added power and a more efficient propeller, the Thunderbolt could climb faster, allowing it to better match the high-speed assaults of the Luftwaffe. It could dive with precision, using its newfound speed and agility to strike before the enemy had time to react. The D-22 Thunderbolt was now not just a tool for protecting bombers. It was a fighter in its own right, capable of taking on any adversary that dared challenge it in the sky. The change in the Thunderbolt's capabilities was especially evident in engagements with the Luftwaffe's advanced fighters, such as the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Bf-109G. These fighters, known for their speed and maneuverability, had long been a problem for American pilots. However, with the upgraded D-22 model, the P-47 could now keep pace with these German planes. The Thunderbolt's new power and speed allowed American pilots to take the fight to the Luftwaffe, engaging in high-speed dives and precise attacks, rather than relying solely on their previous boom and zoom tactics. The improved performance also had a dramatic impact on the effectiveness of the Thunderbolt in ground attack missions. With its powerful engine and enhanced agility, the D-22 could stay in the fight longer, conducting repeated strafing runs against enemy tanks, vehicles, and artillery positions. The 850 caliber machine guns mounted on the P-47's wings delivered a punishing barrage that could destroy almost any ground target in a single pass. The combination of speed, firepower, and durability made the Thunderbolt the ideal platform for these kinds of missions. The new D-22 model was not only an improvement in terms of performance, but also a symbol of the evolving nature of the Allied air campaign. The Thunderbolt had started the war as a bomber escort, a slow-moving, cumbersome fighter that could take punishment but lacked the agility to truly engage in dogfights. By 1944, however, the Thunderbolt had morphed into a multi-role fighter capable of doing much more than its original design intended. It was no longer a one-dimensional machine. With the upgrades, the P-47 became an even more formidable opponent to the Luftwaffe, one that could not only take down bombers, but also excel in high-altitude air combat and low-level ground attack missions. The P-47's new capabilities were quickly noticed by the Luftwaffe, and the D-22's arrival marked a turning point in the air war. The Thunderbolts, once considered too slow to challenge the Germans in dogfights, were now on equal footing with the Luftwaffe's best. The shift in balance was not just a tactical advantage, it was a psychological blow to the Germans, who had long assumed that their superior speed and maneuverability would always give them the upper hand. As the war moved into 1944, the Thunderbolt's newfound power and versatility would play a crucial role in the Allied victory. The D-22 would become the cornerstone of the Allied fighter fleet, capable of taking on the Luftwaffe in ways that were once thought impossible. With its devastating firepower, unmatched durability, and now enhanced speed and climb rate, the Thunderbolt had become the ultimate weapon in the air. The P-47 was no longer just a fighter, it was a force of nature, ready to destroy anything that stood in its way. The Thunderbolt's voice, the roar of a changing war. The new paddle blade propeller not only made the P-47 faster and more agile, but it also gave the fighter a new voice. The deep, thunderous roar of the Thunderbolt could be heard miles away, signaling its arrival. For German soldiers on the ground, the sound meant one thing: hide or face the storm. The introduction of the paddle blade propeller in the P-47 Thunderbolt marked a significant turning point in the evolution of American air power. This upgrade wasn't just about improving performance, it was about creating an unmistakable presence in the skies. The new propeller transformed the Thunderbolt, amplifying its engine's already mighty roar into a thunderous growl that would reverberate for miles. It wasn't just an aircraft flying overhead, it was a force that could be heard before it was seen, and its arrival meant destruction was imminent. For German soldiers on the ground, the roar of the Thunderbolt was a terrifying warning. Unlike the whine of the Luftwaffe's fighters, which could be lost among the sounds of war, the sound of the P-47 cut through the air with a deep, menacing rumble. It was an unmistakable signal. Death was on its way. The Thunderbolt's presence was a harbinger of doom, an omen that once the fighter arrived, it was only a matter of time before the ground below was torn apart by its guns. It wasn't just the noise, it was the power behind it, the weight of the machine, the sheer destructive potential that followed in its wake. For those on the ground in occupied Europe, the roar of the P-47 was the sound of an unstoppable juggernaut descending from the skies. As the Thunderbolts made their strafing runs, the noise became a constant reminder of the Allied air superiority that was sweeping across the continent. Unlike the fast-moving, high-pitched screams of enemy fighters, the Thunderbolt's roar had an almost physical weight to it, a heavy, menacing sound that symbolized the changing tides of war. For the Luftwaffe and the German military, this sound was a stark reminder of the Allies' relentless push forward, a sound that grew louder with each passing day as more Thunderbolts filled the skies. The roar of the Thunderbolt became an integral part of the fighter's identity. It wasn't just a noise, it was a psychological weapon. The sound could be heard long before the Thunderbolt appeared, giving both Allied forces and German enemies a chance to prepare. For the Americans, the roar was a symbol of power, a reminder of the superiority of their aircraft and the might of their industrial capabilities. It was a sound that brought confidence, as pilots knew that their aircraft was not just another fighter. It was a machine that could take the fight to the enemy and return victorious. For the Germans, however, the sound was a harbinger of their own vulnerability. The Thunderbolt had evolved into a multi-role fighter, and its presence meant that the Luftwaffe would have to deal with a new kind of opponent, one that could engage in high-altitude combat and low-level strafing with equal efficiency. The deep, rumbling roar signaled that Allied forces were everywhere, above, below, and all around. German soldiers who once relied on air superiority found themselves in a desperate struggle to maintain control of the skies. The Thunderbolt's arrival in a battlefield was like a storm, impossible to outrun and devastating to face. The thunderous roar also carried with it a psychological impact on German aircrews. While the Luftwaffe had once dominated the skies, they were now facing an aircraft that, despite its size and initial perceived clumsiness, was proving to be a formidable adversary. The new propeller and improved performance meant that Thunderbolt pilots could dive faster, engage more efficiently, and strike with overwhelming firepower. It wasn't just the sight of the aircraft, it was the sound that preceded it, making it clear that the balance of power was shifting. On the ground, the sound of the Thunderbolt was an ever-present reminder of the Allied onslaught. Soldiers who heard it knew what to expect, the low rumble building into a deafening roar as the Thunderbolt dived toward them, guns blazing. The noise was deafening, a constant presence in the chaotic atmosphere of war. German troops, already demoralized by the constant pressure of Allied bombardments, were now forced to contend with the terrifying roar of a fighter that could strike with precision and leave nothing but devastation in its wake. The roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt had become a sound synonymous with American dominance in the air. It was a sound that sent fear into the hearts of the enemy, signaling the arrival of an unstoppable force. With each mission, with each strafing run, the Thunderbolt's presence in the sky was a reminder of the industrial might of the United States and the relentless determination of its pilots. As the war continued, that roar would only grow louder, and the P-47 would solidify its place as one of the most feared machines in the sky, heralding a new era of air superiority for the Allies. For the Luftwaffe, the sound of the Thunderbolt was a constant reminder that their days of dominance were numbered, and the storm was closing in fast. The Air War over Normandy. The P-47's role in D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the P-47s played a pivotal role in the Allied invasion of Normandy. Over 500 Thunderbolts provided air cover, ensuring the success of the operation. As German fighters attempted to break through the skies, they were met with a wall of lead. For the Luftwaffe, D-Day was a devastating reminder of their dwindling power. The invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, was one of the largest amphibious assaults in history, and it relied heavily on air superiority to ensure the success of the beach landings. As the Allied forces began their assault on the beaches, over 11,000 aircraft participated in providing critical support, ranging from bombing runs to providing close air support for ground troops. The P-47 Thunderbolts, having proven their worth in previous battles, were among the most crucial assets in securing air superiority and protecting the ground forces from the moment the invasion began. The primary task of the Thunderbolts during D-Day was to clear the skies of German fighters, who would attempt to intercept the invading Allied forces. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by years of attrition, was stretched thin and unable to effectively challenge the overwhelming presence of the Allied air forces. The P-47, with its devastating firepower and rugged durability, was perfectly suited to this mission. Thunderbolts took to the skies early in the morning, armed with their 850 caliber machine guns and ready to fight. German fighters, including the ever-dangerous Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, attempted to break through the Allied air cover to harass the landing forces. But as they approached the skies over Normandy, they were met with a fierce barrage of gunfire. The P-47s, flying at high altitudes and diving on their targets with unmatched speed, created an almost impenetrable barrier of firepower. The sheer volume of lead that Thunderbolts could unleash in a single pass made it almost impossible for German pilots to get a clean shot off. Their attempts to engage Allied bombers and fighter escorts were swiftly disrupted, as the P-47s overwhelmed them with sheer firepower. The Thunderbolts were not only effective in defending against German fighters, they also took on critical ground attack roles. With their powerful 50 caliber machine guns, Thunderbolts strafed enemy positions, destroying artillery batteries, tanks, and trucks, making it significantly harder for the Germans to mount a strong defense against the advancing ground forces. The Thunderbolt's heavy armament, combined with its ability to absorb hits and stay airborne, made it the perfect tool for these low-level, high-risk missions. The P-47s flew repeated sorties over the beaches and surrounding areas, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the front lines and ensuring that the Allied forces had a fighting chance against the entrenched enemy. The success of the Thunderbolts in the skies over Normandy was not just due to their sheer firepower, but also their adaptability. The P-47, once considered too slow to compete with the Luftwaffe's best, had evolved into a versatile and deadly aircraft. As the war went on, pilots had honed their tactics to take full advantage of the P-47's strengths. In D-Day's complex and rapidly changing battle environment, the Thunderbolts adapted quickly to a variety of roles: air superiority, ground attack, and bomber escort. Each mission they completed with devastating precision. But while the P-47s had their part to play in securing the skies and ensuring the success of the invasion, it was their ability to weather constant combat that made them invaluable. German fighters and flak batteries were relentless, but the Thunderbolts simply kept coming. Many were damaged, some even badly shot up, yet they still managed to return to base and launch new sorties. The ruggedness of the Thunderbolt had been proven countless times, but during D-Day, it reached its zenith. The sight of a P-47, riddled with bullet holes but still flying, had become a symbol of resilience, strength, and the overwhelming might of the Allied forces. The Luftwaffe, for all its once formidable prowess, was clearly on the defensive. The P-47s represented the culmination of American industrial might, a machine that could survive long enough to engage the enemy, deliver its payload of destruction, and then return to fight another day. For German pilots, the realization of the Thunderbolt's toughness and its overwhelming firepower hit them hard. The once unshakable Luftwaffe had been forced to adapt to a new reality, one in which they could no longer control the skies over Europe. D-Day was a devastating blow to the Luftwaffe, and the P-47s were at the forefront of that reckoning. By the end of D-Day, the Thunderbolts had firmly established their dominance in the air. The Luftwaffe's attempts to break through were effectively thwarted, and the German forces on the ground were left vulnerable to the relentless Allied push. The P-47's role in the Normandy invasion was nothing short of crucial. It was a machine that had evolved from a misunderstood fighter into a multi-role powerhouse, capable of taking on any adversary the Germans could field. D-Day was not just the beginning of the end for the Nazis in France. It was the moment the Thunderbolt firmly secured its place as one of the most feared weapons in the Allied arsenal. The Luftwaffe, once an unstoppable force, had been dealt a crushing blow, and the skies over Normandy would never belong to them again. The storm. Over Europe. Thunderbolts versus German ground forces. With D-Day behind them, the P-47s turned their attention to ground targets. Their firepower, once reserved for aerial combat, now obliterated German vehicles and installations. The Thunderbolts became flying artillery, their guns transforming tanks and trucks into smoldering wrecks. As the Allied forces surged into Normandy and began pushing further into France, The P-47 Thunderbolts found themselves playing a crucial role in the next phase of the campaign: ground attack. With the Luftwaffe increasingly absent from the skies, the Thunderbolts, which had once been primarily used as bomber escorts, were now unleashed as devastating strike aircraft. The sheer firepower of the P-47, equipped with 8x50 caliber Browning machine guns and capable of carrying bombs and rockets, made it the ideal weapon for dealing with the German defenses on the ground. The Thunderbolt's guns could deliver a wall of lead that was capable of shredding anything in its path. A single strafing run could decimate enemy infantry positions, machine gun nests, or even entire supply columns. The P-47 pilots quickly adapted to their new role, using the plane's high-speed dive capabilities to strike with precision. They would climb to higher altitudes, spot the target, and then dive down with terrifying speed, opening fire with their 50 caliber machine guns or dropping bombs onto vulnerable ground targets below. The German forces, already reeling from the Allied landings, were now facing a new kind of threat. American fighters that were not only capable of engaging their aircraft, but could also hit them from the ground. The Thunderbolts' high-speed dives and powerful armament made them nearly impossible to escape. Once a Thunderbolt had locked onto a target, it could close the distance with alarming speed, unload a devastating burst of fire, and be back out of range before the Germans could react. The results were devastating for the German ground forces. German tanks, trucks, and artillery positions that had once been a formidable part of the German defensive strategy were now being obliterated by the Thunderbolts from the air. The P-47's ability to carry bombs alongside their machine guns gave them versatility in attacking armored vehicles, supply depots, and fortified positions. One moment, a Thunderbolt would be streaking across the sky, guns blazing, and the next, a German tank would be reduced to a burning wreck. The devastation was immense. German ground forces had been prepared for attacks from the air, but they had expected bombers, not fighters. The Thunderbolt's speed, firepower, and resilience made it a force to be reckoned with. It could dive faster than most of the Luftwaffe's best fighters, and with its heavy armament, it was capable of ripping through even the toughest defenses. In many ways, the P-47 had become more than just a fighter. It had evolved into a piece of mobile artillery, bringing destruction to German forces from above. The Thunderbolt's impact on German ground forces wasn't just in the destruction they wrought. It was in the psychological effect they had. As Allied ground troops advanced, the skies above them were filled with the unmistakable roar of the P-47s, signaling to the Germans that they had no respite. It wasn't just the heavy losses that the Germans were suffering. It was the constant pressure. The Thunderbolts were everywhere, providing support to the advancing Allies and striking at will. No position was safe. The relentless attacks from the sky disrupted German supply lines, morale, and their ability to coordinate effective defenses. In one of the most famous instances of Thunderbolt ground attacks, the 8th Fighter Squadron of the 365th Fighter Group destroyed a massive German supply convoy in the vicinity of St. Lo. The convoy, which consisted of hundreds of vehicles and tank transports, was cut to pieces by the relentless fire from the Thunderbolts. With no protection from the Luftwaffe, the convoy was left vulnerable to the strike, and the result was catastrophic. P-47s would attack again and again, breaking up the convoy and leaving nothing but burning vehicles and wreckage behind. The Thunderbolts didn't just wreak havoc on supply lines and vehicles, they also destroyed vital infrastructure. German communication towers, railroads, and ammunition depots were no match for the Thunderbolts' precision strikes. The planes could target key installations, crippling the Germans' ability to transport supplies, reinforce troops, and communicate with their commanders. The P-47 had become a weapon capable of disrupting the very backbone of the German war effort, making it a force to be reckoned with on the ground as well as in the air. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine River in early 1945, the Thunderbolts had become a symbol of overwhelming force. The German forces, stretched thin and demoralized, were no longer able to counter the sustained air superiority that the P-47s had helped establish. The Thunderbolts' ability to fight in every domain, air-to-air, air-to-ground, and as a strategic force, had made them indispensable. They were no longer just a bomber escort or a fighter in the sky. They had become a multi-role juggernaut, terrorizing the German forces with their relentless attacks from above. The impact of the P-47 on the ground war over Europe cannot be overstated. It was a turning point in the battle for control of the continent, where air superiority didn't just ensure the safety of Allied troops, it was a weapon that could break the back of the German defense. The Thunderbolt had evolved into a force that embodied the full might of the Allied air campaign, and it played a crucial role in bringing about the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The skies had belonged to the P-47, and the ground below had felt its wrath. The legacy of the Thunderbolt, a weapon for the Pacific. As the Thunderbolt proved itself in Europe, it was soon dispatched to the Pacific Theater, where it faced a different set of challenges. In the vast expanses of the Pacific Islands, the P-47's combination of durability and firepower made it a formidable weapon, much to the surprise of Japanese forces. The Pacific Theater presented a unique set of challenges for Allied aircraft. The relentless, wide-open stretches of ocean between islands, the dense jungle terrain, and the small, often poorly developed airstrips on the islands made operations difficult for even the most advanced fighters. Initially, the P-47 was not seen as ideal for the Pacific, with its size and rugged design seemingly unsuitable for the nimble Japanese fighters and the demanding conditions of island-hopping campaigns. The smaller, more agile fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and the F-6F Hellcat were seen as better suited for the Pacific's fast-paced aerial battles. Yet, as the Thunderbolt arrived on the islands and began to see combat, it quickly proved that it had more to offer than anyone had anticipated. One of the key advantages of the P-47 in the Pacific was its immense durability. In the harsh conditions of the Pacific, where long-range flights were common, the P-47's ability to absorb significant damage and keep flying was invaluable. The ruggedness of the Thunderbolt, which had already been demonstrated in the skies over Europe, was just as important in the Pacific. Japanese aircraft, such as the A-6M0, were fast and maneuverable, but they lacked the durability and firepower of the Thunderbolt. The P-47's thick armor and powerful engine allowed it to endure in combat when other aircraft would have been grounded. The Japanese also quickly learned to fear the Thunderbolt's overwhelming firepower. With its 8 50 caliber machine guns, the P-47 could unleash a devastating barrage of bullets on any target. This was especially effective against the Japanese's relatively fragile aircraft, which could be torn apart by a few well-aimed bursts. The P-47 pilots, who had honed their skills in the skies over Europe, adapted quickly to the new theater, learning to use the Thunderbolt's heavy firepower to devastating effect. The P-47's ability to engage at longer ranges, thanks to its massive guns and high-speed dive capabilities, gave it an edge over the more nimble Japanese fighters. But it wasn't just the firepower that made the Thunderbolt effective. It was also the versatility it brought to the Pacific theater. While the Thunderbolt was initially designed as a long-range bomber escort, it quickly adapted to a variety of missions in the Pacific. Its ability to serve as both a fighter and a ground attack aircraft made it an indispensable asset for the Allies. The P-47's capacity to carry bombs and rockets, combined with its devastating machine gun fire, allowed it to take on a variety of roles, from escorting bombers to attacking ground targets and enemy installations. It became a valuable tool in neutralizing Japanese airfields, strafing supply depots, and taking out enemy positions on the islands. The P-47's ability to perform these multiple roles made it an invaluable asset to the Allies. The Thunderbolt also brought something crucial to the Pacific theater: psychological dominance. Japanese pilots, who had been dominant in the early years of the war, were caught off guard by the presence of the P-47. The sight of the Thunderbolt in the sky, with its large frame and powerful engine, signaled that the Allies were gaining momentum. The P-47's ability to withstand damage and still remain operational was a stark contrast to the vulnerability of many Japanese aircraft. The Thunderbolt's sheer resilience in the face of heavy opposition made it a symbol of the turning tide of the war in the Pacific. Perhaps most famously, the P-47 proved its worth during the battles of the Philippines and Iwo Jima. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the P-47s played a crucial role in neutralizing Japanese air forces and providing cover for Allied naval and ground forces. The Thunderbolt's ability to perform long-range missions, often flying through difficult weather conditions and over vast stretches of ocean, made it one of the most reliable aircraft in the Pacific. As the war in the Pacific reached its final stages, the P-47's ability to deliver devastating blows to Japanese forces on both land and air was a key factor in the eventual Allied victory. As the Thunderbolt continued to prove its worth in the Pacific, it became a symbol of the evolving nature of warfare. The P-47, initially conceived as a heavy, cumbersome fighter for the European theater, had evolved into one of the most versatile and formidable aircraft of the war. Its adaptability, durability, and firepower made it a true all-purpose weapon, capable of engaging the enemy in a variety of roles across two very different theaters of war. In the years following the war, the P-47's legacy lived on. Its contributions to the success of the Allied forces in Europe and the Pacific were unmatched, and the Thunderbolt became a symbol of American ingenuity and industrial might. The P-47 Thunderbolt had fought its way to prominence, and in doing so, it had earned its place as one of the most important and respected aircraft of World War II. It was a machine that had proven itself in combat, adapted to new environments, and emerged victorious in the face of overwhelming odds. The P-47 was more than just a weapon. It was a game-changer, and its legacy continues to be remembered today. A monster in the sky. The Pacific Theater's P-47, the P-47's reputation grew in the Pacific. Pilots like Colonel Neil Kirby, who led a squadron of Thunderbolts against 40 Japanese aircraft, showcased the Thunderbolt's extraordinary durability and firepower. While the Japanese expected nimble, fragile fighters, they were met with a machine that could withstand punishment and retaliate with overwhelming force. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first arrived in the Pacific, it was met with skepticism. The theater had been dominated by the fast and agile Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0, which had established a near-mythical status for their speed and maneuverability. To some, the P-47's size, its bulky frame, and its relatively slow climb rate made it ill-suited to the fast-paced, dogfight-heavy style of combat that defined the Pacific. But the Thunderbolt had one advantage that the Japanese aircraft lacked. It was built to survive. The Pacific was an unforgiving environment for both men and machines. The vast distances between islands, the lack of advanced airstrips, and the constant threat of enemy aircraft meant that pilots had to rely on aircraft that could endure damage and keep flying. The P-47 proved to be that aircraft. With its powerful radial engine, thick armor, and rugged construction, the Thunderbolt was able to take hits from enemy fire and continue to operate in combat when other fighters would have been grounded. Pilots found that even after being hit by cannon fire or machine gun rounds, the Thunderbolt would often return to base, battered but still able to fight. One of the most remarkable stories from the Pacific involved Colonel Neil Kirby and his squadron, the 348th Fighter Group, which was stationed on Guadalcanal. On a mission to intercept a Japanese attack, Kirby and his pilots found themselves up against an overwhelming force of 40 Japanese aircraft. The odds were stacked against them, but Kirby's Thunderbolts didn't back down. Instead of avoiding the fight, the P-47 pilots dove in, using the Thunderbolt's superior firepower to engage the Japanese fighters head-on. The result was a stunning display of the Thunderbolt's abilities. Kirby and his squadron managed to destroy several of the Japanese aircraft without suffering any losses of their own. The success of the 348th Fighter Group in that engagement showcased two key strengths of the P-47. First, it demonstrated the effectiveness of its powerful armament. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns could deliver a massive amount of firepower in a short burst, and the P-47's ability to stay on target for longer periods, thanks to its durability, allowed it to use that firepower effectively. The Japanese fighters, while faster and more agile, simply couldn't avoid the volume of fire coming from the Thunderbolt. Even when the Japanese pilots attempted to maneuver out of the Thunderbolt's sights, the P-47's firepower and resilience made it difficult to escape. Second, the engagement underscored the Thunderbolt's ability to survive and continue fighting in the harshest conditions. Even after being shot at by enemy aircraft, the P-47 pilots often found themselves able to return to base and fight another day. This was a key advantage that the Thunderbolt had over the Japanese fighters, which were less robust and prone to catastrophic damage when hit. The Japanese aircraft, though fast and nimble, were far less forgiving when faced with enemy fire. The Thunderbolt's toughness, combined with its firepower, turned it into a formidable foe for the Japanese. What made the P-47 even more dangerous to the Japanese was its versatility. In addition to its role as a fighter, the Thunderbolt was also a highly effective ground attack aircraft. Armed with rockets and bombs, the P-47 could obliterate Japanese positions on the ground. The Thunderbolt's ability to carry a heavy payload, combined with its durability and firepower, allowed it to conduct sustained attacks on enemy airfields, supply lines, and infrastructure. This made it not just a threat in the air, but also on the ground, where it could strike at the heart of Japanese operations. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt had firmly established itself as a major asset in the Pacific theater. The Japanese, who had initially dismissed the P-47 as too large and slow to be effective, were now facing a weapon that could take damage, keep flying, and retaliate with devastating force. The Thunderbolt had proven that it could not only engage in high-speed dogfights with the Japanese aircraft but also provide close air support to ground forces and destroy critical infrastructure. The success of the P-47 in the Pacific was a testament to its adaptability and strength. Where the aircraft had once been considered ill-suited for combat against the Japanese, it had become a symbol of the changing tide of the war in the Pacific. The P-47's reputation as a monster in the sky grew with each mission, as it continued to outlast and overwhelm the enemy. As the Allies pushed forward in their island-hopping campaign, the Thunderbolts were there, clearing the skies and paving the way for victory. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt proved to be a weapon that was far more than just a fighter. It was a versatile, indestructible force that could dominate in both the air and on the ground. And in the Pacific, it played a key role in the eventual defeat of Japan. The roar of the Thunderbolt was no longer just a sound of terror for the Luftwaffe, it was a sound of doom for the Japanese forces as well. Against the jet age, the P-47 versus the Me-262. In late 1944, the Luftwaffe introduced the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. On paper, it was superior to the P-47 in speed and maneuverability. Yet, the Thunderbolt's pilots discovered they could still catch the jets during takeoff or high-speed dives. The P-47's durability made it an unexpected adversary for the jet age. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a significant technological leap in aviation during World War II. Its jet engines allowed it to reach speeds that surpassed the P-47 Thunderbolts, and its sleek design made it an incredibly agile and fast aircraft in comparison to the older piston-driven fighters. In theory, the Me-262's speed should have made it nearly impossible for the slower P-47 to engage effectively. However, the P-47's combat experience, heavy armament, and sheer toughness allowed it to still pose a serious threat to the new jet fighters, proving that technology alone could not guarantee victory in the air. When the Me-262 first entered combat, it presented a new challenge for Allied pilots, who had grown accustomed to fighting German propeller-driven aircraft like the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190. The jet's ability to achieve speeds of over 540 km/h was a considerable advantage, especially in high-speed, high-altitude engagements. Allied pilots knew that they needed to adapt quickly, but the P-47's performance wasn't defined by agility or raw speed. It was defined by its firepower, resilience, and ability to fight under nearly any circumstance. It was in these areas that the P-47 would prove to be an unexpected adversary to the Me-262. The most effective tactic that the P-47 pilots used against the Me-262 involved taking advantage of the jet's vulnerability during takeoff and landing. The jet engines of the Me-262, which required time to spool up before achieving full power, made it sluggish and vulnerable when it was on the ground or just lifting off. P-47 pilots, well-trained in high-speed dives, would use the Thunderbolt's dive capabilities to close the distance rapidly, launching attacks when the Me-262 was at its weakest. The P-47's speed, combined with its firepower, allowed it to make quick strikes on the jets before they had a chance to fully accelerate and escape. Once in range, the P-47's 850 caliber machine guns delivered a devastating hail of bullets, capable of disabling or destroying the Me-262 before it could gain altitude or speed. But the P-47's resilience was just as important as its speed in these engagements. The Me-262, though fast, was still a jet in its early developmental stages. Its engines were prone to mechanical failure, and the jet's airframe was not as robust as that of the P-47. Many times, the Thunderbolt's ability to take hits and continue flying gave its pilots the edge in combat. The P-47's design allowed it to absorb damage that would have crippled other fighters, and its pilots exploited this advantage in combat with the Me-262. Even after encountering German jets in intense dogfights, many P-47s returned to base, often riddled with bullet holes, but still ready to fly again. The real shift in the battle between the P-47 and Me-262 came when the Thunderbolts began to focus on attacking the Me-262s before they could even engage in combat. P-47 pilots, with their formidable experience in strafing runs, began to target the Me-262s on the ground and during takeoff. It was here that the P-47's durability and ability to survive extensive damage proved to be the deciding factor. While the Me-262 could easily outrun the P-47 in level flight, the Thunderbolt's resilience allowed it to get into position to attack when the jet was at its most vulnerable. As the war continued, the Me-262's presence in the skies grew, but it was not the game-changer the Germans had hoped it would be. The P-47's ability to keep pace in these engagements and exploit the weaknesses of the jet made it an invaluable tool in the Allied arsenal. The jet age had arrived, but the Thunderbolt had shown that it was not a relic of the past. Rather, it was an aircraft that could hold its ground, even against the most advanced machines the Germans had produced. The battle between the P-47 and Me-262 was a testament to the adaptability and perseverance of the Thunderbolt and its pilots. The Me-262, with its technological superiority, was a formidable foe. But the P-47's combination of firepower, speed in high dives, and sheer durability allowed it to remain an effective counter. As the Allied forces continued their push toward Germany, the P-47 played a crucial role in limiting the effectiveness of the Me-262, preventing the German jet from altering the course of the war. Despite its technological advancements, the Me-262 could not overcome the raw power and resilience of the P-47 Thunderbolt. By the time the war came to an end, the P-47 had proven itself as a versatile and powerful aircraft, capable of taking on the fastest jets of the day and emerging victorious. The Thunderbolt's ability to adapt to the changing nature of air combat and continue to dominate the skies was a testament to the strength of its design, its pilots, and its place in aviation history. Even against the Me-262, the P-47 had stood firm, cementing its legacy as one of the most formidable fighters of World War II. Bodenplatte, the last stand of the Luftwaffe. In January 1945, the Luftwaffe launched one of its final desperate attacks on Allied airfields during Operation Bodenplatte. Despite destroying several P-47s on the ground, the German pilots were outmatched. The American ability to replace lost aircraft in mere hours demonstrated the stark contrast in industrial might between the two sides. Operation Bodenplatte was a last-ditch attempt by the Germans to regain control of the skies over Western Europe. The Luftwaffe had been steadily losing ground to the relentless Allied air assaults, and the introduction of Allied fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, which had proven its dominance in both the air and on the ground, was a constant thorn in the side of the German war effort. By the winter of 1944, the Luftwaffe had suffered heavy losses and had been forced into a defensive posture, unable to mount large-scale attacks against the advancing Allied forces. The Germans' plan for Operation Bodenplatte was ambitious, a bold effort to strike at key Allied airfields, hoping to cripple the Allied air power by destroying their aircraft on the ground. With fewer and fewer experienced pilots and fewer resources, the Luftwaffe relied on surprise and precision. They launched a massive attack, focusing on Allied air bases in France, hoping to cripple the air superiority that had been a cornerstone of the Allied push across Europe. But in the face of overwhelming odds, the Luftwaffe found itself on the defensive once again. The Germans' initial successes in Operation Bodenplatte were limited. They managed to destroy several P-47s on the ground, a temporary setback for the Allies. But the real strength of the Allied air forces lay in their ability to recover and replace lost aircraft with astonishing speed. While the Germans were struggling to maintain their fighter squadrons, the Americans were rapidly producing new aircraft at an industrial scale that the Germans could not hope to match. The P-47s, once thought of as cumbersome and slow, had become a symbol of American industrial might, each Thunderbolt a manifestation of the United States' ability to outproduce and outlast its enemies. As the Luftwaffe launched their attack on the airfields, they quickly realized that even when they succeeded in destroying American aircraft, those losses were quickly mitigated by the sheer volume of replacements that could be rolled out within hours. While the Germans struggled to find enough fuel, parts, and trained pilots to sustain their attack, the Americans were ready to strike back. Within hours of losing P-47s, new aircraft were sent to replace them, and pilots who had been grounded by the attack were quickly rearmed and sent back into the fight. The Luftwaffe pilots, on the other hand, had fewer planes, and their chances of recovery or reinforcements were becoming increasingly slim. This stark contrast in industrial capacity highlighted the central flaw of the German war effort. While they had superior technology in certain areas, they could not match the scale of production and logistical support that the Allies had achieved. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once the underdog in the war, had become a symbol of that superiority. The sheer resilience of the P-47, combined with the ability to replace lost aircraft almost immediately, showed that the balance of air power was no longer in the Luftwaffe's favor. The Battle of Boden-Platte marked a key turning point in the final months of World War II. Despite the Luftwaffe's desperate attack, the Germans found themselves unable to deal a decisive blow to the Allied air forces. Their losses in both aircraft and experienced pilots were irreplaceable, and the strength of American industrial power in the form of the P-47 Thunderbolts was evident. What had once seemed like a strong, agile, and capable force had become an exhausted, dwindling shadow of its former self. For the Americans, the ability to withstand these attacks and keep fighting was not just a matter of military might, it was a testament to the success of their wartime economy. The U.S. was able to produce aircraft at a scale and speed that left the Germans scrambling to keep up. The P-47s, which had once been considered slow and inefficient, had now proven themselves capable of surviving intense combat and quickly returning to the fray. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant air force of Europe, had become an exhausted force, unable to keep pace with the Allies' relentless production and strategy. The Battle of Boden-Platte marked the effective end of the Luftwaffe's ability to challenge Allied air supremacy. The Germans could no longer fight the war they once had. As the Allies pushed forward, the Thunderbolts, with their overwhelming firepower, resilience, and ability to replace lost aircraft, continued to dominate the skies. The Luftwaffe's final desperate attempts were futile, as the United States' industrial might and the effectiveness of aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt made the difference in the outcome of the war. By the time the war in Europe drew to a close, the P-47 had cemented its legacy. Not just as a fighter aircraft, but as a symbol of the unrelenting industrial power that had crushed the Axis. The Luftwaffe's last stand, symbolized by the Boden-Platte offensive, highlighted the irreparable imbalance that the Allies had created through their unmatched capacity for production and their unyielding air supremacy. The War of Attrition. Production overwhelms the Luftwaffe. By 1944, the United States had produced more than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts, and they were still coming off the assembly lines. Each aircraft was built faster than Germany could replace its pilots. The relentless flow of American fighters made the Luftwaffe's losses unsustainable. The war, it seemed, was over. The Allied production machine, especially the U.S. aircraft industry, had reached unprecedented levels of output during World War II. While the Luftwaffe, despite its technological innovations, struggled with fuel shortages, diminishing industrial capacity, and an increasingly inadequate supply of experienced pilots, the United States continued to ramp up its production of fighter aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt. By 1944, the sheer scale of American production had turned the tide of air combat in Europe. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies, was now being systematically overwhelmed by an unstoppable tide of new, durable, and lethal aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the most significant symbols of this production advantage. Despite its relatively high cost and complex design, the Thunderbolt became a workhorse for the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAAF, thanks to its ruggedness, firepower, and versatility. The United States could afford to produce these aircraft in vast quantities, while the Germans struggled to maintain a steady output of their own. The American industrial capacity, which had been mobilized on an industrial scale, allowed for a continuous flow of P-47s, a steady stream that kept the skies above Europe swarming with Allied aircraft. By the end of 1944, the production of the P-47 Thunderbolt had outpaced the Luftwaffe's ability to replace its own losses. The Germans faced a grim reality. They could no longer afford to replace their experienced pilots and aircraft at the same rate as the Allies. As American factories churned out more P-47s, German factories, already under constant Allied bombardment, struggled to keep up with demand. The Luftwaffe's aircraft production was further hindered by shortages of materials, particularly aluminum and high-quality steel, which had previously been readily available. Additionally, the increasing effectiveness of Allied strategic bombing raids meant that German factories were under constant attack, further reducing their capacity to produce the fighters necessary to defend against the overwhelming Allied onslaught. On the battlefield, this imbalance began to tell. The Luftwaffe's pilots, many of whom were fresh out of training schools and lacked the combat experience of their predecessors, found themselves up against well-seasoned American pilots flying some of the most durable and advanced fighters available. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its formidable armament of 850 caliber machine guns, powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, and rugged construction, was a formidable opponent even for Germany's most advanced fighters. But what truly set the P-47 apart was its ability to take damage and keep flying. American pilots, many of whom were veteran combatants by 1944, had grown accustomed to flying through the most intense combat conditions and returning to base after suffering substantial damage. This disparity in numbers and quality of pilots contributed to the Luftwaffe's increasingly desperate situation. The P-47's ability to absorb punishment and still continue fighting stood in stark contrast to the fragile German aircraft, which were easily brought down by Allied fire. The loss of a single P-47 was tragic, but it was a small setback compared to the losses the Luftwaffe sustained, where a single downed aircraft meant the permanent loss of a highly trained pilot and valuable resources that could not be easily replaced. As American air forces flew daily missions over German-occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe was forced to respond with fewer and fewer experienced pilots. Their pilots, once some of the most skilled in the world, were either being lost in combat or sidelined due to exhaustion, poor training, or lack of resources. The Allies, meanwhile, continued to train new pilots at a rapid pace, filling the ranks of their ever-growing fleet of Thunderbolts. The once feared Luftwaffe now found itself facing a foe that was not only superior in numbers, but also in industrial strength. The relentless production of P-47 Thunderbolts led to a situation where, by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was facing an unsustainable loss rate. Pilots who managed to survive engagements were quickly rotated out, and the increasing frequency of Allied attacks on German airfields and industrial centers made it even harder for the Germans to recover. By the time the Allies reached the heart of Germany in early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, with fewer planes, fewer pilots, and little ability to defend against the relentless tide of Allied fighters. In contrast, the United States' ability to maintain an uninterrupted supply of new aircraft, including the P-47, ensured that the Allies would maintain air superiority. Each P-47 that was shot down could be replaced quickly, and each pilot who fell in combat could be replaced with another. The war in the skies over Europe had become a battle of attrition, one that the Luftwaffe could not win. The P-47 Thunderbolt had played a crucial role in this shift, not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of the Allied industrial power that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis forces. The relentless production of the P-47 Thunderbolt was a game-changer in the war for the skies, and it ultimately played a key role in ensuring Allied victory. The contrast between the Allied industrial machine and the German struggle to replace their aircraft and pilots proved to be a decisive factor in the collapse of the Luftwaffe and the ultimate success of the Allied air campaign. As 1944 turned into 1945, it was clear. The war was no longer just a contest of technology. It was a war of industrial might, and the United States had won. The transformation of German respect, a shift in attitude. By 1945, the once dismissed Thunderbolt had become the most feared aircraft in the sky. German pilots who had once mocked it now spoke of it with a grudging respect. Their earlier dismissals had been replaced with recognition of the P-47's overwhelming power and the unstoppable force it represented. In the early days of the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt had been an enigma to the Luftwaffe. Its large, bulky frame and slow climb rate led many German pilots to dismiss it as a clumsy, ineffective fighter. Early encounters with the Thunderbolt were a source of mockery, with the Germans believing that such a cumbersome aircraft could not possibly stand up to their more agile fighters like the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190. The Allies, too, initially struggled to realize the full potential of the P-47, often using it in a limited capacity as a bomber escort rather than a fighter in its own right. But as the war dragged on, particularly in 1944 and 1945, the true capabilities of the Thunderbolt became apparent, not only to the American pilots flying them, but to the German forces who had underestimated them. The P-47 was not just durable, it was a powerhouse in the sky. With 8 50 caliber machine guns capable of delivering sustained, devastating firepower, the Thunderbolt was capable of destroying enemy aircraft with shocking speed. Its heavy armor, designed to protect its engine and cockpit, allowed it to endure hits that would have grounded any other aircraft. The P-47 could take damage and continue fighting, becoming a symbol of resilience and unrelenting force. As Allied pilots adapted their tactics, the P-47's role in the war expanded. Its high-speed dive and ability to withstand sustained enemy fire turned it into a formidable adversary to German aircraft, even their fastest and most advanced models. The P-47 was no longer just a slow escort fighter. It had evolved into a multi-role aircraft capable of both air superiority and ground attack. Its sheer presence in the sky became a terrifying reminder to the Luftwaffe that their air superiority was no longer assured. German pilots, who had once written off the Thunderbolt as a poor design, began to recognize the P-47 as a force that could not be ignored. They saw the Thunderbolt's guns tear through their aircraft with ease. They watched as P-47s, damaged beyond belief, still managed to limp home, proving their remarkable durability. What had once been a laughingstock had become a nearly indestructible juggernaut, capable of taking on the Luftwaffe's best pilots and coming out on top. The Thunderbolt had earned the respect it once lacked, and its reputation as the most feared Allied fighter in the sky spread throughout the German ranks. By 1945, German reports were filled with mentions of the P-47. It had transformed from an underestimated threat into one of the primary reasons why the Luftwaffe could no longer maintain its grip on the skies. No longer was the Thunderbolt seen as a flying milk bottle or a slow, cumbersome target. Instead, it was recognized for what it was, a deadly adversary capable of dealing out destruction with overwhelming force. German pilots began to understand that fighting the Thunderbolt was no longer a matter of outmaneuvering it. It was about surviving the brutal barrage of gunfire that came from the P-47's massive armament. The shift in German attitudes was also a reflection of the broader changes in the war. By 1945, the Luftwaffe had been stretched to its limits. It was losing pilots faster than it could replace them, and its aircraft production was under constant attack by Allied bombing raids. The sheer volume of P-47s being produced and sent into combat was simply overwhelming. Where the Germans had once dominated the skies, they now found themselves fighting a battle of attrition. The overwhelming numbers of Thunderbolts, their relentless firepower, and their durability meant that no matter how hard the Germans fought, they could not break the Allied air superiority. The Thunderbolt's role in the final months of the war, particularly during the Allied invasion of Germany and the subsequent air campaigns, was crucial. It was no longer just a symbol of industrial might. It was the spearhead of the American effort to break the Luftwaffe's resistance. The Germans had no answer for the P-47's combination of power, endurance, and firepower. They could not match the Allies in terms of industrial capacity, and they were no longer able to outmaneuver the P-47 in combat. By the time the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had secured its place as one of the most formidable and respected fighters of the war. The aircraft that had once been mocked by the Luftwaffe had become their greatest nightmare. The Thunderbolt had not only withstood the full force of the German Luftwaffe, but had helped to shatter their control of the skies, turning the tide of air combat in favor of the Allies. The P-47 was no longer a symbol of American overconfidence. It had proven itself in the air and on the ground, and its legacy as a war-winning machine was firmly cemented in history. The transformation from ridicule to respect was a testament to the Thunderbolt's resilience, adaptability, and sheer power. It had earned the respect of even its most formidable adversaries, and that respect was hard-won in the crucible of combat. The end of the Thunderbolt's legacy. A sky cleared. When the war finally ended, there was no room left for the German pilots' laughter. The sky had changed, and with it, the balance of power. The P-47 Thunderbolt, forged in the fires of industrial production and combat, had defeated the Luftwaffe and reshaped the future of aerial warfare. The Thunderbolt's legacy was sealed not just by the destruction it caused, but by the profound impact it had on the course of air combat. In the years before the United States entered World War II, many believed that air superiority would depend on speed, agility, and the ability to outmaneuver the enemy. The P-47, however, proved that air superiority could also be achieved through sheer firepower, resilience, and the capacity to endure. Unlike the sleek, high-performance fighters that defined the early stages of the war, the P-47 was a testament to the strength of industrial might. It was a machine built to take damage and keep fighting, a new kind of fighter that would change the very nature of aerial warfare. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Thunderbolt had proven itself in multiple theaters, from the skies over Europe to the islands of the Pacific. Each mission, each sortie, demonstrated its exceptional firepower and resilience, ensuring that it was not only feared by its enemies, but revered by its pilots. The 8 50-caliber machine guns mounted on the P-47's wings could shred enemy aircraft in a matter of seconds, while its durable construction allowed it to survive in ways that no other aircraft could. Whether it was bombing German supply lines or providing close air support for ground troops, the Thunderbolt's versatility and toughness made it indispensable. The Thunderbolt had earned its place as one of the most formidable fighters of the war, and in the end, it helped to break the Luftwaffe's stranglehold on the skies over Europe. By the time the war came to an end in May 1945, the Luftwaffe had been driven into near extinction. The relentless pressure from the Allies, combined with the overwhelming numbers of P-47s and other Allied aircraft, had worn down what was once one of the most formidable air forces in the world. The Germans could no longer replace their pilots at the rate required to keep up with the unrelenting assault from the air. Their airfields had been destroyed, their factories bombed into rubble, and their ability to mount an effective defense against Allied air power had dwindled to almost nothing. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which had once been mocked and underestimated, had become the hammer that crushed the Luftwaffe, and with it, the backbone of Nazi Germany's ability to wage war in the air. The P-47's final victory came not only in its ability to defeat the German fighters, but in its demonstration of the power of industrial warfare. While Germany had focused on advanced technology and innovation, the United States focused on mass production and logistics. The ability to replace lost aircraft in hours, coupled with the constant flow of Thunderbolts rolling off the assembly lines, ensured that the Allies had the edge in attrition warfare. The Germans, on the other hand, faced a critical shortage of both aircraft and pilots, and their losses could not be replenished as quickly as the Allies could replace their own. This shift in the balance of power was the result of industrial might, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was the weapon that embodied this new way of waging war. In the post-war years, the legacy of the P-47 lived on as a symbol of American industrial strength. Its impact was not limited to the immediate years of World War II. It reshaped the way future conflicts would be fought. The lessons learned from the success of the P-47 and other Allied fighters influenced the development of air doctrine and tactics in the years to come. The P-47 had proven that a fighter didn't need to be the fastest or the most agile to be effective. It needed to be able to endure, to deliver firepower, and to be adaptable to the changing nature of warfare. For the German pilots who had once laughed at the P-47, there was nothing left to say. The skies had shifted, and the balance of power had irrevocably changed. The Thunderbolt had proven its worth in every theater of war, and by the time the war came to a close, it had firmly established itself as one of the greatest fighters ever built. The P-47 was no longer just a symbol of American might. It was a living testament to the power of industrial production, strategic adaptation, and the unyielding resolve of those who flew it. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not just an aircraft. It was a force that reshaped the course of history. It marked the end of the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies and the beginning of a new era of air warfare, one where power, resilience, and industrial might would be as crucial to victory as speed and maneuverability had once been. As the world entered the post-war years, the legacy of the Thunderbolt continued to resonate, reminding all that the future of warfare would be built not just on innovation, but on the relentless ability to outproduce and outlast the enemy. The sky, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the Allies, and the P-47 Thunderbolt had helped ensure that it stayed that way.